Right, so there's been an almighty kerfuffle in Rochdale since last night with the Rochdale by-election as news has dropped, albeit by the fail on Sunday, so caveats for the poor source. However, what has transpired since does appear to bear out what they've said. Labour's candidate there, Azhar Ali, has made past comments in line with the Egyptian version of events leading up to the night of October 7th in Israel and Gaza, and not towed the Israeli line about such matters, and that Zionist without qualification, Keir Starmer, can't have that. There are somewhat mixed messages about what has already been done about this by the party, but with Ali reportedly on a train to London as I was writing this to meet with Starmer, is Starmer about to throw the Rochdale by-election for the sake of Israel, or is he merely using that as an excuse because he's already lost it to George Galloway? Right, so what's happened then, Damo? Well, if you aren't already familiar with this story, which somewhat dominated Sunday morning's politics discussions, then what we're looking at is either the final nail in the coffin of Labour's campaign to hold on to the seat of Rochdale, or it's Labour's excuse for basically admitting defeat, but it can't be Starmer's fault. It has to be the candidate. And the candidate, Azhar Ali, for all his faults, is being hung out to dry for basically agreeing with Egypt's version of events leading up to October 7th, and not the dross Israel came out with, which is about as close to the truth as Keir Starmer is to keeping his policies. Now, I spoke about Egypt's explanation for how things escalated going into October 7th previously. As regular viewers know, I've covered the events in the Middle East closely since October 7th. I think we in the West have a responsibility to do that against that backdrop of mainstream media excuses, and especially as we're seeing the genocide play out across social media. But Egypt, who have for a long time acted as mediators between Israel and Hamas, warned Israel that Hamas were building up to something ahead of October 7th, and instead of shoring up their defences, Israel appears to have basically allowed it to happen. They denied they knew anything about this, about anything about to kick off. Egypt have basically called them out for that, basically calling them liars. But the Israeli forces downgraded defences. They, in light of everything we've seen since, right up to virtually the entire surviving population of Gaza now being pinned down in Rafah with nowhere left to go. It seems Israel likely let October 7th happen as an excuse to do what they've done since. The takeover of Gaza, the elimination of Hamas, all the civilian deaths that's cost, new settlements potentially springing up as they take Gaza over afterwards, all things Benjamin Netanyahu's mad hard-right coalition partners desire. Ali apparently told a meeting of the Lancashire Labour Party that the Egyptians are saying they warned Israel 10 days earlier. Americans warned them the day before that. There's something happening. They deliberately took the security off. They allowed that massacre that gives them the green light to do whatever they bloody want. Now, Ali is himself a Muslim. You can appreciate that might have been genuine anger in his casual admittance of what is far, far more believable than anything Israel has said. But of course it'll never wash in the Labour Party of Keir Starmer, and he wants to be an MP, and as such an apology quickly followed the release of his previous comments. Ali said, "I apologise unreservedly to the Jewish community for my comments which were deeply offensive, ignorant and false. Hamas's horrific terror attack was the responsibility of Hamas alone, and they are still holding hostages who must be released. October 7th was the greatest loss of Jewish life in a single day since the Holocaust, and Jews in the UK and across the world are living in fear of the rising anti-Semitism. I will urgently apologise to Jewish leaders for my inexcusable comments. The Labour Party has changed unrecognisably under Keir Starmer's leadership. He has my full support in delivering the change Britain needs." Which Jewish community? Many agreed with what you said to start with. Were the events of October 7th entirely Hamas's doing when Israeli gunships were conveniently ready to be deployed and were seen killing people fleeing the Nova Music Festival, along with the Hannibal directives that multiple eyewitnesses claim to have seen enacted to kill their own citizens rather than see them taken hostage? October 7th was the greatest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust, but that doesn't get away from the fact that so many more people have been killed in Gaza, which nobody ever seems to acknowledge. Ali would have won some plaudits if he'd stood by his words, I'm sure. Instead, he put himself first, his aspirations first, and all he's actually ended up achieving is turning even more people off him, and likely towards the Galloway campaign as a result. He's already stopped campaigning in Muslim areas, such as the anger he's faced there, and that demographic is one vote in every 3 in Rochdale. Labour are defending a 9,000 vote majority there, and right now it's looking decidedly ropey. They'll hang on to the seat, which moves the story on somewhat to what happens next. Now, as things stand at time of writing, Ali remains the candidate for Labour. He said all of this, an apology has been sufficient, yet compare that to the recent case of Kate Osamor, left-wing SCG MP who dared acknowledge the Gaza genocide on Holocaust Memorial Day. She issued a Labour whip-induced apology, which she was told would be sufficient. However, she was later suspended and probably now won't be allowed to stand in the general election in defence of herself. Ali being allowed to stand still in the light of his comments, so well, hypocrisy just doesn't seem a big enough word, does it? Leaving Ali in place makes it blatantly obvious that Labour are letting his comments slide purely for their own ends. At a time when Labour are leading massively in national polls, the fact they are looking likely to either lose this seat with that large majority, despite it, or cling on to it by the fingernails, is shambolic and makes those national polling figures look mad, which I think they probably are. However, I've been made aware this morning that Ali is apparently on a train bound for London with a meeting with Keir Starmer. Now, if Starmer were to be consistent for a change, he'd suspend Azhar Ali over his comments. I don't agree that he's wrong, but this is Starmer we're talking about. If he's going to be consistent as he was with Kate Osamor, you can see him doing the same thing here. Quite why he needs to go to London for that and speak to Starmer himself, though, I don't see the point of that, unless something more is going on. Starmer might want to let him in on what is actually going on behind his impending suspension, perhaps. You see, Labour are looking right now at losing what should be a safe seat to George Galloway. Embarrassing doesn't quite cover that. Suspending their candidates, though, and saying, well, they can simply say, well, we picked a wrong un, even though he's only a wrong un in their opinion because he told the truth. But when that truth goes against the Zionist grain, it can't be allowed to stand in Starmer's Labour. They save face, Starmer gets to pretend he's strong on anti-Semitism, but in actual fact he's just bending to Israel's will. He'd be suspending a candidate and losing a seat for the sake of Israel. Ali told the truth. He echoed Egypt's claims at the very beginning of this latest assault on Gaza. There's no incentive for them to lie. And if that doesn't show a truly scary level of obeisance to Netanyahu's regime, I don't know what does. That'll be the biggest example to my mind of where his loyalties truly lie, so far seen. And the media and the mainstream media won't point that out at all. But actually, for what he suspended Kate Osamor over, he leaves himself completely exposed to that. The seat would undoubtedly go to George Galloway should this happen. But perhaps that's a price worth paying to Starmer's mind short term, because Galloway will, of course, have to defend the seat again at some point later this year. Effectively handing it to Galloway now is less damaging than losing to him, potentially winning it back off him if and when Galloway ends up using the seat as a vehicle for himself rather than serving Rochdale. Starmer will be damned as even more of Israel's man than ever if he suspends Azhar Ali and faces an embarrassing defeat if he doesn't. He's damned either way. People need to realise it as the mainstream instead sell him as taking strong action on racism, which is just ridiculous. He just weaponises it. Egypt warned Israel in advance of October 7th, and if you would like more detail on the basis of Azhar Ali's comment or to refresh your memory on that, it seems so long ago now, doesn't it, then you should watch this video here next, where I went into more detail on that story, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so the list of independent candidates taking on Keir Starmer and his Labour candidates is growing ever more. The latest being former South African ANC politician Andrew Feinstein, having been selected by the independent grouping Okisa to stand against Keir Starmer himself as their candidate. As Labour continue to show they are nothing more than red Tories, we need alternatives to that on offer, and so they are appearing. We're sick of the Tories. We're sick of their politics. Labour is supposed to be different. But under Starmer, it has been utterly undone and destroyed as an opposition to that. So slowly, gradually, independent candidates opposed to all of that, standing for the stuff Labour should be as a truly left-wing socialist democratic party, are appearing. The Observer have described this as a wave of independent candidates. So it's the way of party politics, having ultimately failed to represent us for years and years now, falling by the wayside, and our voters becoming more attracted to individuals who will put them in their areas first, rather than party politicians only interested in furthering their own careers. Right, so brilliant news this morning, following on from my video yesterday, that Andrew Feinstein has indeed been selected as the Okisa candidate, the independent Okisa-sponsored candidate. Okisa are not a party. He is truly going to stand as an independent. Stand against Keir Starmer in Holborn and St Pancras, winning the nomination by a colossal 95%. As a former ANC politician, as someone who worked in economics and finance as part of that ANC government in South Africa, as someone who is a lifelong opponent of the global arms trade and an opponent of apartheid, he represents everything that Keir Starmer is not. But not only that, being a resident of Holborn and St Pancras now, as he is and has been for some years, he recognises the issues of the people there. And this is another front where Starmer falls short, as if we need to be told about another one where he falls short. Regarded as a terrible local MP as he is, not interested in where he lives, only fixated in getting into number 10. He's the sort of MP that takes no interest in local campaigns, never answers emails from constituents, the pro-NHS privatisation Starmer refusing to engage, for example, with a local campaign to even save primary healthcare provision. Large numbers of his own constituents don't even know he's the leader of the opposition. That's how bad he is, how disinterested in ordinary lives he is. So little wonder his party is run as is it? Little wonder so many people, not just in Holborn and St Pancras, can't stand him, but feel the same nationwide. So in that vein, is it little wonder people are organising in pockets around the country to stand candidates of their own and are funding them to do just that? You see, that's the ultimate barrier to independent standing and succeeding at national level. The cost is obscene. The Tories are already trying to stack the cards in their own favour ahead of the next election because they have more money than anyone else. They have the bigger donors, don't they? By raising the election spending cap by 80% to around £35 million nationally, that if spent evenly works out at nearly £54,000 of spending per seat, how can ordinary people possibly compete with that? Organisation, obviously, turns out to be the answer. OKISA have had a crowdfunder going for months. They are, at time of writing, have reached nearly just past £13,000 for Feinstein. Now, and obviously, we'll be looking for further donations, and such is the case for other independents sprung up because they've come about as part of local movements. Local voters getting together, sick of their poor representation in Parliament and an electoral system that seems to mean they can't shift the incumbent. Raising funds, raising awareness, bringing more people on board as a local movement for local people, and selecting someone from amongst their own ranks to stand. There are numerous examples now, up and down the country. I've spoken of Ilford North before and their candidate Leanne Mohammed. They have Wes Streeting as their MP, pro-Israel, pro-Starmer, locally invisible as well, a total careerist seemingly bent on further NHS privatisation. And in response to his awful pro-Israel stance, there have been protests outside his constituency office, organised, again, by local people, coming together to oppose what he represents and what he stands for. And in this case, it is the Redbridge Community Action. Again, they are raising funds set on combating what Streeting stands for, which is whatever Starmer does, joined at the hip as they seem to be, and standing a young British Palestinian woman against him, again, in and of itself, sends a message. Shows beyond doubt in what way she is opposed to Streeting, but equally is campaigning on a platform of a fully renationalised and funded NHS, again in stark contrast too. She's also from Ilford North, unlike Streeting, who's from Stepney. And the whole point of a local MP elected by local people from amongst themselves, cutting out the whole political party frame, means if they were to win, still a challenge, they'd be completely beholden to those same local people to serve their needs, for them to support them to defend the seat in future. No longer would big party political capital or lobbying from vested interests work, if you think about it. In Bethnal Green and Bow, I've spoken about the protests at Labour MP Rafah Ali in previous videos, as she abstained on a ceasefire vote, despite having a massive Muslim population in her constituency. Now local lawyer Tasni Makunji is standing to challenge her, and his support in his candidacy is coming from the influence of that large local Muslim population, plus the additional support that will come from Muslim candidates via the new, far more national but still grassroots movement that's sprung up called the Muslim Vote. Ali's reputation locally is in pieces off the back of Labour's Gaza stance. That won't shift, as beholden to the Zionist lobby as the party is. So for Muslims to get the representation in Parliament that they deserve and want, they need to put forward their own people. Now this all seems very nice and very London-centric so far, Damo and fair dues, these examples are. Arguably London Labour MPs, I suppose, have caused more anger, or you can also argue that London is particularly multicultural and diverse, but not exclusively so. People are angry, and there are multicultural areas across this country, of course there are. Up in the northwest, let's go up there, the Liverpool Community Independents, they came into being off the back of awful local Labour representation in Liverpool, and they are putting on one of their own number forward to challenge Labour MP Maria Eagle in the newly created seat of Garston, created due to the boundary changes that are coming in. Locally, their candidate, Sam Gorst, great guy, great socialist, formerly Labour, but left as part of a group that became the Liverpool Community Independents, defended his seat on Liverpool City Council successfully in Garston against Labour, and now they seek to up the ante and take out the Labour MP there as well. And who would doubt their ability to do that? Like so many of the people involved in these independent campaigns around the country, they are people driven away from Labour, disgusted by what Starmer has done to the party, the actions he's putting in place, the diktat he's instigating, the organisers, the campaigners, the experience he's lost as a result of that, will now all be deployed against him, all getting around local representation for local people and the issues that matter in their constituencies. But as the Liverpool Community Independents showed, it doesn't just have to be at that top national level that this is done. They, after all, began at local level. And although it is these big general election cases that make the news, it's happening nationwide at local level as well. The last set of local elections were bad for the Tories, but they were also poor for Labour, when really there was no excuses for that, being out of power for as long as they have. Their gains were outweighed by losses that were completely avoidable, as people turned, yes, notably to the Green Party, who did astonishingly well, but also to independent candidates too, who are always far more prevalent at local level. The Morning Star reported at the beginning of this month that ex-Labour councillors are assembling on the 2nd of March at a literal conference to plan electoral opposition across the country to the Labour Party, particularly in light of their ongoing warmongering pro-Israel stance, which we know will not shift. It's pretty much the only thing Starmer is guaranteed not to U-turn over, because he owes too much to the lobby, bought and paid for in a way, as I've said already, that a truly local independent candidate never could be, because they'd lose their funding in future to stand again if they did, reliant on local people to fund their campaigns. The conference is going to be called No Ceasefire, No Vote. It is primarily aimed at MPs going into the general election, but with local elections coming up soon again, that forms part of their agenda as well. It'll be a very interesting set of local elections this year, I fancy, because I can quite conceivably see Labour right now losing seats like the Tories undoubtedly will. Both main parties having a nightmare, and Tories completely done for as they are also, utterly deservedly. But equally, there is still so much scope for independents to step up and challenge in more seats in more areas if they can get organised. Time, of course, is running out. There's going to be a general election this year at some point. The Muslim Vote organisation is there to facilitate this in many areas, but it doesn't have to just be down to them. It doesn't have to be just down to Muslim voters across the country, wherever they are. An example of where a campaign I think could be mounted quite successfully would be Leeds West. The seat of Keir Starmer's Chancellor of a Chancellor, the George Osborne austerity wannabe, Rachel Reeves. Now, she has a majority not much bigger than that which Labour currently hold in Rochdale, a seat they look set on losing right now. There's a Muslim population in Leeds West, not a huge one, but not insignificant either. They will no doubt be furious with their MP as well. But right now, Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules mean voters can only look forward to more Tory economics should Labour win the general election. The bigger issue in her constituency, I feel, since she'd be in charge of the nation's purse strings, is poverty. And that's certainly a platform somebody could successfully campaign on. Let's have a look at child poverty just as one aspect of this. The UK rate of relative child poverty sits right now at 20.1%, according to the government's latest figures. In Reeves' seat of Leeds West, it's 24.6%, so nearly 1 in 4 kids living in her own constituency is in relative poverty, which is defined as living in a household where the income is below 60% of average, so living on close to half what the average household takes in. That equates to an annual income of £19,380. Now let's look at absolute child poverty. That is defined as living in a household where the income is below 60% of the average income back in 2011, which is a very strange way of measuring it. We don't just measure it as a percentage against current levels. That's probably because we would be shocked and appalled. It is shocking and appalling because I did the maths. And this is equal to an annual income here and now of just £12,180. Can you get by on roughly £1,000 a month? Well, the average UK rate of absolute poverty, that income rate, is 15.3%. That's appallingly high for such a horrendous rate of child poverty. But in Reeves' Leeds West seat, it's 18.7%. Nearly 1 in 5 kids. She's going to become Chancellor of the Exchequer, knowing the stats, knowing what it is like amongst her own constituents, and she, instead of doing what is needed to fix this, is instead saying we can't afford to, that we can't tax wealth either, that bankers should keep their bonuses too. It's food for thought for anyone thinking of standing against her, isn't it? But this is just one example. Independent standing is one thing, but the party politics landscape of our government can only be broken with people getting behind them and voting for them. So for anyone saying they've got no choice or there's nobody for them on the ballot, well, perhaps it should be you then. Anyway, it would be remiss of me to not offer a big congratulations to Andrew Feinstein for getting selected to stand against Keir Starmer, and do support his campaign now if you can by helping out with that crowdfunder. It's on crowdfunder.co.uk and it's called Starmer Out Beats Starmer in Holborn and St Pancras. You can find out a lot more about Andrew in this video just here. The word is Starmer's team are absolutely raging that he's been selected because, frankly, he terrifies them. They're afraid Starmer could end up being Jo Swinson. Remember her? And they're right to be concerned, frankly, with the likely way this country is set to be run following the general election. Seeing Starmer fall could be one of the biggest highlights of it. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so this is an interesting allegation that's come out this morning, the latest revelation concerning Labour's candidate for the Rochdale by-election, which is implying that Keir Starmer might be getting the Jeremy Corbyn treatment. It would seem that Keir Starmer is upsetting the powers that be in the Labour Party, by which I mean the Zionist lobby. It seems they aren't very happy with him, which may surprise you to hear, and as a warning shot to him, to remind him who's really in charge, they've committed a bit of sabotage on Labour's election candidate there. People to this day blame Corbyn for Labour's failure in 2017 and 2019, yet Starmer, a right-winger, is having it done here and now to him by the internal party machine and their pro-Israel backers. And if the detail of these allegations are true, Labour will never run this country in UK interests, because they simply won't be allowed to. Right, so what's going on here then, Damo? Well, this is Rochdale by-election time again. It's becoming quite the soap opera-style saga up there now, isn't it? Especially when it comes to Labour and their candidate. Over the weekend, we had these revelations come out, didn't we, about Labour's Rochdale candidate Azhar Ali. That in response to the events of October 7th, when Hamas went into Israel and seized hostages. It was alleged by the Egyptian government that they had warned Israel that Hamas were planning something big, and in response Israel did nothing, even apparently going so far as to downgrade their militias in the nearby kibbutzes. It's as if they allowed it to happen. Now Israel have vehemently denied this. However, they've been consummate liars throughout and have been proven to be so on multiple occasions, usually getting caught out because they are hilariously bad with their excuses. But Egypt have got nothing to gain by lying about this. Nonetheless, as regular viewers of my channel will know, Azhar Ali offered a grovelling apology and admittance that he was wrong. That as things still stand right now has been enough for the party and he remains their candidate. Talk of him having been summoned to see Starmer, as I mentioned previously, has yet to come to pass, it seems. He appears to have been in Rochdale yesterday when he was supposed to be on a train. Once again getting rinsed by local people, though. Labour really do seem to set to lose this Rochdale by-election. However, the latest news to come out is that Starmer's team are apparently now blaming someone who is being described as a Labour right, pro-Israel NEC member for leaking the details of that story, of these comments made by Azhar Ali to the media, and that this was done as a warning to Starmer to not go soft on his support for Israel's actions in Gaza. This should absolutely horrify people both within Labour and outside of it. Someone on Labour's National Executive Committee, their highest level of authority as that is, has deliberately, allegedly, damaged Labour's by-election chances, already damaged as they were, to basically remind Starmer who's in charge and what is expected of him. It underlines the fact that, once again, he really isn't the one in charge here. And as much as some of us have pointed out to Blair and Mandelson previously, saying they're the ones that are operating him from behind the scenes, the Zionist lobby clearly are the ones prepared to go to any lengths to ensure Starmer remains on message without deviation. As far as that description of an NEC member goes, it's very difficult to look past this being anyone other than Luke Akehurst. As soon as Labour, right-wing, pro-Israel and NEC all end up in the same sentence together, the only guy you tend to think of is Akehurst. though he hasn't been named specifically. Akehurst has always been pointed to as an issue when countering the Zionist lobby, since he is literally a paid advocate for Israel. His day job is promoting Israel, being director of an organisation called We Believe in Israel. For years he was kept off the NEC while Corbyn was leader, despite his best efforts to get back onto it. Yet as soon as Starmer took over, the very next set of NEC elections saw Akehurst come top of the vote, even above well-known lefties at the time who were still up there, such as Laura Pidcock. That raised my suspicions because it just didn't appear to make sense to me. And to this day I smell a rat on that, but that's just my view. I've no evidence to that. Nevertheless, the lobby are showing some clout, it seems, from somewhere. I can't say I've noticed Starmer watering down his message at all in support of Israel, but that would be because he hasn't. This warning, this throwing away potentially of a Labour seat, it's all because there are fears Starmer might go soft. As Israel becomes more and more blatant, as court cases are filed at the ICJ, even against the UK now, aiding and abetting in Israel, Labour's leader is being told by those who are really in charge, it seems, don't you dare go soft on us, or else. Take this as a warning. It's political terrorism. If Labour's team really wanted to paint another target than their boss right now, they should name them so we are without doubt who this is that has done this. Otherwise, well, there's a possibility that this is just more of them making excuses ahead of what is expected to be a defeat. But equally, how much more damage could be done at the general election if Starmer continues to give his overseers cause to fear him about going soft? This is about paranoia from them, isn't it? It's not out of any actual softening of Starmer's position. But equally, if Labour are like this now, when they are on the way to winning the next election, at least if you buy into these national polling figures they are, how ridiculous is it that this sabotage goes on now? Of course, it is the same thing they did to Corbyn, and they weaponised anti-Semitism to do that. They didn't want him. He couldn't be controlled by them. He couldn't be bought. Also shows how happy Zionists are to weaponise racism against Jewish people for their own ends, in which numerous people have stated over the years is what they always do. We were denied the opportunity for change in this country under a Corbyn-led government by such people. Now they're happy to deny us even red Toryism if they aren't able to control them and remind the so-called leader who's actually in charge. These people would rather see Sunak and his inept rabble of Conservatives carry on and stay in power if they can't control Labour. This is what they did in 2017 and 2019. It's what they're threatening to do again, and it should shed fresh light on what actually happened in Labour under Corbyn in those previous elections. Of course, there's a very easy solution to all of this. For all of us as voters, don't vote Labour. Vote for someone else. Get behind another alternative party or indeed one of the multitude of independent candidates springing up across the country. If Labour cannot provide an opposition and will not be permitted to put the needs of this country first, then how on earth can we possibly vote for them? If it was Russia and not Israel behind the scenes here, our mainstream media would never shut up about it, would they? We'd all be being encouraged by all and sundry on the TV and on the politics programmes to run a mile from Labour. Instead, there is, so far, complete silence on this. Apart from all that, though, there's another issue here, if indeed an NEC member made this leak. Quite clearly, Starmer's Labour have allowed Azhar Ali to stand despite knowing all about what he said, in which case, despite having suspended or expelled others for the same or less. Ali is a Starmer's faction, though, isn't he? And it proves suspensions and expulsions are not evenly handed. They're not handled fairly. They are weaponised factionally, since a free pass has been given to Ali and not to, for example, Kate Ossamore, come back to her again, for showing solidarity with Gaza on Holocaust Memorial Day. That news that she was told an apology, just as Ali is given, would be fine, but in her case it was followed up with a suspension anyway. That now sounds even more like the actions of the Zionist lobby, who really seem to be in charge. Naturally, Twitter have once again had a say on the matter. Just a couple of examples here. Daffodil wrote, "Oh, the irony. The most right-wing genocide-supporting Labour Party in recent times, yet the Zionists still aren't happy. Who's really in charge of the Labour Party? Because it sure doesn't look like Starmer." And Harris wrote, "So the guy who has destroyed his own reputation as a human rights lawyer is now being threatened by those who he defended for not supporting genocide strongly enough. You couldn't make this up." No truer words said. Labour has a massive Zionism problem, a problem prepared to keep them out of power and lose elections again if needs be to ensure they stay in control and know whoever they allow to be leader knows it too if they harbour any ambitions to run this country. That is seriously scary. It's not just the Labour Party, of course, that has accusations of being compromised against it here and now, though. The ICC in The Hague does too, still having failed to bring a single prosecution case against anybody in Israel, despite the ICJ having found Israel guilty of a plausible case for genocide. What gives with the ICC prosecutor in which case? Plenty, it might appear, the details of which I've covered here. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so the largest refugee camp in the world is how the city of Rafah in southern Gaza is being described right now. Over 1 million people there, half the population of the Gaza Strip, huddled up in the last place the IDF and the Israeli authorities said was safe for them. Israel forced these people there. They told them it was for their own safety, and now they are all there. They're being targeted by military strikes ahead of a likely ground offensive with absolutely nowhere left to go. Last week, Israel began making advances on Rafah, targeting the tent city that has sprung up alongside the main city, swelling the size of the last refuge of the Gazan people. Last night, the carpet bombing began. A sleepless night, described as a night of hell in a place where people say you are suffering a slow death, either killed by the impending Israeli attacks or killed by the disease, lack of food, lack of humanitarian aid of any sort. And so this point was proven last night as 63 people were killed in the vicinity of the Kuwait hospital in Rafah. Again, Israel targeting areas around hospitals, potentially the hospital itself in time, deliberately destroying the health system so disease becomes even more rife without solution, and the world just seems to keep on sitting and watching. Right, so last night was the most intense attack on Rafah we've seen to date, the last refuge of the people of Gaza as we know it is, and just to show how much Israel already knows they are despised around the world for what they are doing, breaking the ICJ ruling against them with impunity, they timed this attack whilst the people of their biggest backers, the US, their eyes were averted because they timed their attack on Rafah to coincide with the US Superbowl. 100 million Americans' eyes were glued to that, so weren't aware of what was happening in Gaza at the same time. They would have certainly found out later. What about their so-called leader, Genocide Joe, then? He posted this image. While airstrikes and carpet bombing were going on in Gaza, he posted this. It's nuts. On the other hand, perhaps I have it all wrong. He has bombed Yemen, Iraq, Iran and Syria this week. Perhaps this is the most honest image of himself he's ever posted. Anyway, self-glorification of himself aside, Biden has said an offensive against Rafah isn't credible without safe passage for civilians, and publicly and to Biden's face, Netanyahu has agreed with him. The problem is, there's literally no way of facilitating this. There's nowhere left for these people to go, and even if there were, why in God's name would they trust the IDF, Shin Bet, or anything Netanyahu says on the matter in order to deliver on that? Israel have literally blown up convoys of civilians on the way to where Israel have been sending them. They've sniped kids in the street. Rafah right now is being described as hell on earth, but the whole of the Gaza Strip has been described as a cemetery for children. The fact that half the population of Gaza is under 18 is never said often enough. This is a war on kids. So with this mild shift in Biden's narrative, he's still supplying arms, of course, is a split likely if Netanyahu invades Rafah on the ground too, with the scale of death and destruction given the concentration of people there now? I'll believe that when I see it. Netanyahu, for his part, has equated saying don't go into Rafah to losing the war, but a war is something conducted by two sides against each other. This is one of the best armed, least moral armies in the world, fighting kids mostly. It's a massacre and always has been. 70% of the people killed have been women and children for a reason. Even more perversely perhaps is the fact Netanyahu, after ditching a ceasefire plan that would have seen all Gaza hostages freed, a 4-month ceasefire, is still using the hostages held by Hamas as an excuse to continue his assault, despite the fact they would have been free. Apparently enough of them are still alive to warrant continuing with the assault, he said. But when asked how many were left alive, all he'd say was, enough. In other words, he doesn't know. The only reason he spurned that ceasefire is because he can't politically afford to end this conflict. I've said it will continue, no matter where Palestinians go. He'll claim Hamas are hiding amongst them still, and use that as an eternal excuse to persecute them down to the last man. Israel have, of course, as we know, killed some of their own hostages given their indiscriminate act. There's been a lot made today over the fact 2 Israeli hostages have actually been rescued. I know, hold the bus, Israel have actually saved some of their own people. But that means their military offensive has now rescued a grand total of 3 hostages since October 7th, and the first rescue since October itself. How come, after all this time, they've been so bad at rescuing their own people? Was that not the whole purpose of going into Gaza? To my mind, it shows they haven't actually been trying, and of course that wasn't their real reason for going into Gaza. When this is a government with such a thing as a Hannibal directive in existence, you can't say that this is a regime that puts value on life. In fact, it values the lives of Palestinian hostages in its jails and keeping them there more than the lives of their own people. The whole point of the Hannibal directive is to kill their own people before they're taken hostage, and therefore Israel put in the position where they have to do hostage exchanges. The big caveat I would put on this is that none of the mainstream media are actually doing is that this claim of 2 rescued hostages has come from Israel. So are they really rescued hostages then, or just another setup? Because really, why are you taking Israel's word for anything at this point? Another possibility was spelt out by US news outlet Axios, came via their political analyst Barak Ravid, who tweeted out, "The IDF and Shin Bet have been working on the rescue operation for several weeks based on intelligence. The operational opportunity came today. The Israeli Air Force conducted heavy airstrikes in Rafah as a diversion to allow the extraction of the 2 hostages." Well, that implies the 63 people killed in Rafah through airstrikes last night died, so Israel could rescue 2 hostages. That is psychotic. The Q8 hospital, like all hospitals through Gaza that have stood and fallen, is getting overwhelmed too, as one of the few hospitals still standing. It is already struggling with patients sick or malnourished, and now more and more caught up in military strikes are going in. Aid is struggling to get in. It's nowhere near enough anymore with the number of people now concentrated in Rafah. Roughly 1 truck an hour is getting through the Rafah crossing. And it's also struggling to get through via Israel and its border crossings with Egypt, as Zionist settlers are now setting up tents themselves with the intention of remaining at those crossings to stop aid intended for Gaza from getting through. They've been so successful at this that Israel have closed one crossing because of them at Kerem Shalom, and a planned visit by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken to oversee aid deliveries was cancelled, again because the aid can't get through. And instead of arresting these sick individuals, Israel's just shrugging its shoulders at the lack of aid getting in. The Biden administration just keeps wringing its hands instead of doing something as well, just sitting and watching and letting it happen, just as so many other Western nations are doing. Complicity for as long as they provide any kind of aid or assistance to Israel whilst they are doing this. None of it in our names. Back to this matter of safe passage, though. Assuming Israel do provide some, somehow. What safe passage and to where? Repeatedly, the IDF and other Israeli security forces have stopped the people of Gaza returning north as they have cleared those areas and forced people south, shooting people that have attempted to do that. But now, of course, they are as far south as they can go. There's no way they'll allow people north again in case Hamas persists. That's what they'll say. Of course it's what they'll say. So there's only one real direction they can be pushed, but it would risk a political fallout with Egypt if they did it. Israel wants control of the Rafah border crossing, and if they get it, who's to say they won't just open it, and in the name of survival, of course the Gazan people will pour into Egypt. There's literally nowhere else, no other option. If they can't control it, who put it past Israel to blow a big hole in the crossing so that people can flee through that instead? Egypt have already been reinforcing the crossing, fearing this could happen, but it wouldn't stand up to an Israeli military attack. Of course, even this depends on Israel being taken at its word and providing safe passage at all, and even if they did that, they'd probably just blame Hamas for it instead. Though I don't want to contemplate where that train of thought particularly takes me. Unless there is a concerted effort to stop Israel entering Rafah right now, it's going to happen. And still, even now, nothing is done. We just watch. A completely reasonable ceasefire offer was put on the table before Netanyahu, and he turned it down. Details of that and his motives for doing so can be found on this video recommendation right here. Well worth a watch if I say so myself. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so things have finally reached a head in Rochdale, and Labour have formally dumped their candidate Azhar Ali, giving up the seat. In effect, things got a bit sticky wicket for them over the weekend when Ali went against the official back Israel at any cost, no matter what they say, no matter how hard it is to believe party line, by daring to have an opinion of his own. and agreeing with Egypt's explanation that despite having warned the Netanyahu regime something big was in the offing from Hamas, Israel likely facilitated the events of October 7th to give them the excuse to do what they've done in Gaza over the last 4 months. Yet somehow, some way, media reporting on this has been to blame not Keir Starmer, of course. 4 years into his leadership of the Labour Party, he's the anointed one to take over the country after all, the establishment choice now. No, they decided this clearly has to be all Jeremy Corbyn's fault. Right, so Labour's Rochdale by-election campaign has completely blown up in their faces, completely their own fault and completely their own doing. But would you Adam and Eve it? The mainstream media seem to be blaming Jeremy Corbyn, or at least they want to put that seed of thought in your head, rather than blame the Brill Cream to Burke and the Zionist lobby that is basically in control of the Labour Party now. So, first and foremost, the Labour Party campaign of Azhar Ali in Rochdale is done, and it's done because of Labour's preposterous position on anti-Semitism. Ali did nothing but disagree with the Israeli line, the Zionist line, on the events of October 7th. Egypt's position has already been widely reported as contrary to that. The entire nation of Egypt hasn't been labelled racist as a result, but more and more people, as events have moved on, as Israel's claims get debunked more and more often, making that nation utterly untrustworthy in its claims. Yet because disagreeing with Israel, with Zionism, is equated to anti-Semitism under Starmer's Labour, itself a racist notion, the state of Israel is not above critique, and it sets a dangerous precedent to try and enforce that. But it's too late now for Labour to replace Ali, and his name will still appear on the ballot as Labour's candidate. Labour's spokesperson on this said in a statement, "Following new information about further comments made by Azhar Ali coming to light today, the Labour Party has withdrawn its support for Azhar Ali as our candidate in the Rochdale by-election. Keir Starmer has changed Labour so that it is unrecognisable from the party of 2019. We understand that these are highly unusual circumstances, but it is vital that any candidate put forward by Labour fully represents its aims and values. Given that nominations have now closed, Azhar Ali cannot be replaced as the candidate." Yes, we know Starmer's changed Labour unrecognisably from the party of 2019. It's now a carbon copy of the Tory party, and as for its aims and values, it's whatever the Zionist lobby tell them. Nominations have closed. Ali will still appear on the ballot as Labour's candidate, but having been suspended from the party should he win, he will sit as another independent candidate in Parliament. If I was Ali, despite public grovelling and apologies for speaking his mind, I'd give Starmer beef should he get to Parliament. But let's face it, this has really all happened because Labour were going to lose. That would be toxically embarrassing because they were going to lose to George Galloway, and now surely Galloway will be the runaway winner in Rochdale now. Now, some might point out, having seen my previous coverage on this by-election, that Ali has apologised and still been suspended, just like Keir Starmer now, isn't he? Damo, you old rotten lefty, some might be thinking. You tried to make out that Starmer was singled out, yet look at Ali. Well, there's one big difference here, and if you refer back to the first thing the spokesperson said, it was that new information has come to light. That wasn't true of Starmer. But equally, Labour have chosen not to share said new information, so I smell an excuse. And Labour's very much are factional, they've just had no choice, and bearing that out, making it oh so obvious, is some of the contortions happening by those who regularly attack the left with accusations of anti-Semitism, now bending over backwards to excuse Azhar Ali, who has been accused of that as well, even though there's no evidence here to support that, and I'm no fan of the right wing. I've no reason to defend Ali here myself, other than to point out anti-Semitism has once more been weaponised for Labour's convenience, it appears, given they won't share this new evidence, and their double standards and abuse of Labour's disciplinary systems have been exposed for utterly factional motives. I brought up Louise Ellman, former MP, one of Labour's loudest Zionists, the other day, since she's a pal of Azhar Ali. They got photographed together. Her hypocrisy and double standards on anti-Semitism has been shown on a tweet, much of which she repeated on Radio 4's Today programme this morning. But the tweet read, "I am appalled at Azhar Ali's comments repeating outrageous and deeply offensive conspiracy theories. It is right he has given a full apology. I have known Azhar for over 20 years, and he has consistently supported me when I was subjected to anti-Semitic attacks." No calls for his expulsion for his comments then. Benefit of the doubt expressed. Is that because he's your mate in this instance? How long shall we say you've known Jeremy Corbyn for? Where was the benefit of the doubt for him when all those accusations against him were made? You just joined in with them, though, didn't you? That's because you wanted him toppled, so there was none, was there? She's not the only one doing the political equivalent of circus-level contortionism over anti-Semitism in relation to one of their own faction, though. Adam Langelben's another one, currently the director of right-wing Labour vehicle and what used to be called Progress, standing for everything that absolutely wasn't and still isn't progressive, but now calls itself Progressive Britain. Long-time vocal opponent to what Corbyn stood for and those supporting him. He said on the Azhar Ali situation, "Tough choices in real politics. It's quite clear that Labour's candidate in Rochdale shouldn't have been, nor be the candidate now, but legally he cannot be removed. Ordinarily, in any other by-election, I would probably advocate Labour laying down tools on principle. In any other by-election. What's different about this one, then? So you think Labour members should still campaign for this chap, then? Why an exception here? What's different? Surely if you're so invested in fighting racism as you purport to be, there can be no exceptions. Is it because he's your faction, then? More benefit of the doubt, is it? What have the Jewish Labour movement said on this, then? They're bound to have said something, aren't they? They are the arbiters of all things anti-Semitism in Starmer's regime. Not that you need to be in Labour or Jewish to be a member of them, and let's face it, they're more about supporting Zionism than fighting genuine anti-Semitism. But their chair, Mike Katz, has also had his say. More contortionism, saying, Azhar Ali's comments are totally reprehensible, but this close to polling day, electoral law says he will be Labour's candidate, whatever Starmer says or does now. Ali's destroyed his past record of allyship with the Jewish community and has a mountain to climb to repair. I take issue with this notion that people cannot be forgiven for a transgression by simply apologising for it anymore. How much is enough to satisfy you then, Mikey? How big is that mountain to climb? What's he got to do? Is it 12 labours of Hercules stuff here? And who made you the judge and jury anyway? All Azhar Ali has done that we publicly know of, the new information that has come to light aside, is share Egypt's view of what happened on October 7th and not Israel's, which, given Israel is still allegedly responding to that 4 months on, gives weight to Egypt's view that this was intentional in order to do what they are doing now and have done ever since. That they let these things happen, that they let the events of October 7th happen, that it gave them the excuse to commit the genocide they are now committing and have been doing for months. That's Ali's crime, not anti-Semitism, but voicing an anti-Israel view. Confusing anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism is still very much the mainstream narrative here with the media, all despite the recent court case exonerating Bristol University academic Professor David Miller, which has made the landmark ruling that being anti-Zionist is actually a protected characteristic. Ali, if he feels like it, if he feels justifiably wronged by what has been done to him by his own party, therefore, surely has a right to recourse due to that ruling. Miller himself has spoken out on the findings, but only in alternative media because no mainstream media have approached him for comment. The same thing happened regarding the Ford report and Martin Ford, the author of that. Only Al Jazeera gave him a platform, and again, small independent media paid any attention to what that report said and what he himself had to say on those matters. Miller tweeted out just this morning in reply to someone asking him about just this, saying that, "No, Yvonne, I have not had a call from BBC News. Most of the mainstream press has, though, referred to the decision in my case as a landmark, which it is. I have not, however, been interviewed by any mainstream media outlet in the UK. I'm not hiding. They can pick up the phone or reach me via email. As anyone with access to the internet can tell, I have been interviewed all over the world on non-mainstream outlets, on podcasts, on X/Twitter Spaces, Al Jazeera, Mayadeen, Glenn Greenwald's System Update, on RT, Press TV, Pacifica, TNT and others, including right-wing outlets such as Talk TV, GB News, Unity News. Mostly that's in English, but also in Turkish, Arabic and Farsi. I used to be on the BBC all the time, but largely since the illegal invasion of Iraq, the space in the mainstream has contracted and constricted. It's a long road, but we are winning, and the last place that will become visible is in the Western mainstream media. And he is completely correct in that assessment, which finally brings me on to Jeremy Corbyn getting tied up in all of this. Thought you'd never get to the point, Damo, I'm sure some of you might be thinking. Well, This is in relation to Channel 4's coverage of what has happened in Rochdale, and as you know, on the TV news they always put up an image of said person that they are talking about, and Channel 4, often regarded as one of the better mainstream outlets, proved it is very much still a mainstream outlet, with all the caveats that should come with that, by showing an image of Azhar Ali sharing a stage with Jeremy Corbyn. Corbyn has had nothing to say about Azhar Ali throughout all of this at all. He's had nothing to say about the Rochdale by-election at all. Yet Channel 4 decides to use an image of Azhar Ali to imply, to subliminally say, look folks, he's a Corbynite. Boo! Hiss! Using this image, much more recently, obviously, of Ali stood with Starmer, would have been far more accurate. But that's not how our mainstream media works. Do you see how it does work, though, yet? There was outcry and outrage. The story on Channel 4's website, which was also carrying this image, has now had the image of Ali with Corbyn removed. So badly have Channel 4 been burned by people incensed at their dishonest framing of the story and the man at the centre of it. Deservedly so, of course. And again, it reinforces the point I regularly make to support your favourite, smaller, independent news outlets if you can, because they rely on their reputations and their accuracy to even get by, to exist. Not to mention, of course, the funding of them by their audience, for whom many of them simply couldn't do what they do without it. Mainstream dishonesty is literally why this channel, as an example, came into existence, and I'm certainly not alone in that story, being a familiar one amongst other bloggers, vloggers, writers and journalists, supported by you, for you. So if you can, do support them, whoever they are. Of course, it isn't just what the mainstream media frame some stories as that is the problem. Equally part of the problem is them not covering what is important at all, such as the rise in the numbers of people across the country getting organised and choosing independent candidates from amongst their own to stand to represent them in Parliament, instead of putting up with yet another invisible MP, not interested in them, only in it for their own career prospects. The recent selection of former ANC politician Andrew Feinstein to stand against Keir Starmer himself garnered some mainstream interest, but there are far more than just Andrew standing, and they deserve to be noticed too for who they are standing against and what they are standing for, as this video will tell you all about. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next video. Cheers, folks. Right, so the ongoing Israeli attacks on Gaza have reached the end of the line as far as new targets go, having reached the border city of Rafah, where the crossing into Egypt lies, and it is hardly any secret anymore that there are a number of people in Netanyahu's hard-right coalition cabinet that would dearly love to see the Gazan population pushed through that crossing and into the Sinai desert of Egypt. Without any right to return, Israel of course denied Palestinians that right. These people would never be allowed back. But what would you do if your back is against the wall and you have a choice between dying or escaping into Egypt through the hole that's been blown in the crossing right next to you? Do you really think Israeli forces wouldn't accidentally or on purpose blow a hole at that border wall, take out all of Egypt's shoring up of the border as well, and provide a route to desperate people which is literally their only path to survival? Well, if all this hasn't escaped your attention, then you know it hasn't escaped that of the Egyptian authorities either. And they've taken a swipe across Israel's bows by threatening to tear up the Camp David peace accords if the people of Gaza get pushed into Egypt. Right, so Egypt, it would appear, are prepared to risk all-out war with Israel right now if their actions in Rafah result in the Gazan people getting pushed into Egypt. Now, for people following the events in Gaza over the last 4 months, especially if you've followed this channel during that time and the content I've put out, you'll know that this is the end game for a lot of people in positions of power or influence in Israel. An entire conference held by the Nahala settler movement played host to numerous far-right government ministers, and not just those from the hard-right coalition parties that are keeping Benjamin Netanyahu in post, but members of his own Likud party too. And they've drawn up plans for Gaza, haven't they? Post-Palestinians, of course, with Israel moving in, taking over and rebuilding all the old settlements that were taken down some 20-odd years ago now, and building whole new ones as well. Where do the people of Gaza go then? Well, these people do not care, do they? They can leave or they can die is pretty much the attitude, but go where? The world won't take them. That's what UNRWA is there for, after all, to look after Palestinian refugees, as they've done since the Nakba of 1948. But they're still being defunded, despite Israel's claims against them not worth a hill of beans, right down to the story of a Hamas tunnel under UNRWA headquarters. This is the latest harebrained idea that's come out of the Israeli Defence Forces, which turned out to be a cellar for solar-powered inverters. A power source for the building, in other words, underground to keep them cool. It's the Indonesian hospital tunnel story all over again. Do you remember that one? The alleged tunnel there turned out to be a rehabilitation pool for amputees. The lies just keep stacking up and getting debunked, and why anyone takes Israel's word for anything anymore, I really don't know, because you literally need mug tattooed on your forehead if you do. There are currently over 1 million people in Rafah now. It's swelled from the normal 300,000 people it's typically home to, thanks to an entire city of tents rising up next to it. A ground invasion is imminent, apparently, from Israel, and for as much as a diplomatic end to this, a permanent ceasefire is being called for by millions of people across the globe. As the protests and demonstrations continue, the political will to deliver that is nowhere to be seen, mild critique seeming to be all that is on offer from our Western leaders. If something doesn't shift shortly, things now look like they could escalate significantly to a level that would have been so avoidable if Western leaders in a position to impose a cessation and put Israel in its place and make Benjamin Netanyahu sit down, shut up and listen to reason did so, because there's now a not insignificant risk of war breaking out between Israel and Egypt. Should the Rafah border fail by accident or design, who's going to blame all those Gazans running to safety by escaping into the Sinai desert? Nobody. Surely we would all do exactly the same as them in that place. It's certainly not them that Egypt's got beef with. But if these people end up being made their problem by being in their territory, they've been made their problem by Israel. And as such, a threat has now emerged in response to Israel's actions in Rafah to suspend what are called the Camp David Accords. What be they then, Damo? Well, allow me a brief digression to get into that. Now, Israel and Egypt have had several conflicts in the past. 5 times they have gone to war with each other, and given Israel, bear in mind, has only existed since 1948, that's quite some doing. First, there was the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 in response to the creation of Israel, during which, ironically, Egypt seized control of the Gaza Strip. There was the Suez War of 1956, the Suez Crisis. Of course, Egypt controlled the Suez Canal. Egypt were involved in the Six-Day War of 1967 when Israel seized more of Palestine. Egypt lost control of the Gaza Strip and the Sinai here too, and Israel placed what was left of Palestine under occupation, of course. In 1968 there was the War of Attrition, where Egypt was supported by Russia to attack Israel following the Arab state defeat the year before, but the most potentially lethal conflict came in 1973 in the form of the Yom Kippur War, which outside of the Cuban Missile Crisis is the closest we've ever come to a nuclear exchange. Clearly something had to be done to de-escalate this situation between Egypt and Israel, and on the 17th of September 1978, under the Jimmy Carter US administration, at Camp David, hence the name, the retreat of the US President as that is, the accords were signed by both the Egyptian President and the Israeli Prime Minister of the day. And was such a big deal, both men ended up being awarded that year's Nobel Peace Prize. 14 months of diplomatic efforts had come to fruition. It is regarded as one of the biggest achievements of the Carter administration. The eventual outcome of these talks was called the Framework for Peace in the Middle East and had 3 parts. 1, a process for Palestinian self-government in the West Bank and Gaza, still an issue as we know. 2, a framework for the conclusion of a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. And 3, a similar framework for peace treaties between Israel and its other neighbours. Now, on that second point, a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel was signed the following year in 1979. Now, the main features of this peace treaty were mutual recognition, cessation of the state of war that had existed since the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, normalisation of relations, and the withdrawal by Israel of its armed forces and civilians from the Sinai Peninsula, which Israel had captured during the Six-Day War in 1967. And on top of that, Egypt promised to leave the Sinai Peninsula demilitarised. So there's the backstory to this. Now, as things look increasingly likely that Palestinians may be facilitated to escape into the Sinai, by accident or design, as I said, Egypt are threatening to suspend these accords, and as such that peace treaty as well, which came about as a result of them. Israel and Egypt went to war 5 times over 25 years, but haven't gone to war in over 45 years now because of these accords, because of that peace treaty. Yet now the actions of Netanyahu in Gaza risk sparking suspension of that, an end to that, if the people of Gaza are driven into Egypt. These accords have withstood numerous incursions, intifadas, other wars, yet it is this genocide being committed by Israel now that risks bringing them down. The nuclear threat that had existed between Egypt and Israel in 1973 is still there, though depends on Russian involvement in the situation, since it was Russia's arsenal that Egypt potentially had access to previously. Egypt are not a nuclear nation. The US would be in a pickle, since they supply arms to both countries and might have to pick a side. God knows they seem determined not to choose peace after all. However, the Suez Canal and access to it might be a swinger for the US to go against Israel, potentially. Ultimately, the biggest losers would be the Gazan people, though, because if Egypt make good on their threat and suspend the accords, they'll have escaped a war zone, only for the war zone to get potentially expanded even more. We already have the US bombing Iran, bombing Yemen, bombing Iraq, and bombing Syria, and that's just in the last week. Saudi Arabia is kicking off at the situation in Palestine, well-armed military as they have, and lots of money for financing more. Jordan have not so subtly reminded Genocide Joe that it's within his power to deal with this. Egypt has said they are preparing to spend millions if their border gets breached at Rafah. This conflict just seems to keep spreading and escalating, and still there's no real sign of any will to put the brakes on Israel to bring all of this to a shuddering halt. The bigger this conflict gets in the Middle East, the more nations that end up becoming involved, the bigger the failure on the part of our leaders there will be for doing jack to actually meaningfully end it. Sanctions need placing on Israel. It needs doing like yesterday. Rejecting a ceasefire should have been enough to warrant that, but hasn't been, as this video here will explain all about. I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so racism and the Labour Party have been an ongoing story since Jeremy Corbyn ran the show, of course, except where various reports on his time in power, such as the Labour Leaks report and the Ford report, not to mention documentaries such as Al Jazeera's excellent The Labour Files showed, racism in all its forms was being challenged under Corbyn. He was being undermined every step of the way from within by the Labour right, still in control of the party administration, as they were, not to mention their right-wing mainstream media allies, especially The Guardian, that so-called liberal paper, painting the lifelong anti-racist leader as the worst of racists, the anti-Semitism scam as it was. But by weaponising that, opening that can of worms, it's turned out to be a poisoned chalice for the current Labour Party, for the Labour Party that came later, the party of Starmer, the party of the Zionist lobby, the wing of the party where the racism really lies. And having opened this Pandora's box on anti-Semitism to bring down the first mainstream political party leader in decades who would have transformed this country for the better for ordinary working class people up and down, repeatedly saying the fish rots from the head as a swipe against that leader of the party who is ultimately responsible. So now as the real racism of the Labour Party gets exposed, the failure of Starmer to actually deal with it, in fact every accusation made against Corbyn falsely, can now be aimed at Starmer with a case to back it up. And Labour are now suffering for it in an overdue show of karma. The fish truly does rot from the head. Right, so racism in the Labour Party is one hot topic of conversation again, as it should be when it is the genuine article, and it is failing to be dealt with. In fact, a blind eye is being cast to people to suit the current leadership, unlike previously where it was not, despite claims to the contrary by the many enemies that Corbyn had within the party and without, such was the fear of change by some, the representation of establishment interests that he threatened by others. Keir Starmer was always the establishment's man. The knighthood should give that away. Frankly, in this day and age, any politician accepting some sort of a gong has doffed their cap to changing nothing in this country. And sadly, 2 out of 3 main party leaders are knighted, and the other one is Sunak, and who wants more of him? But equally, it shows the probable alternatives are no better, and so it is coming clear to more and more people, despite mainstream media's silence mostly on the matter, that Keir Starmer is no better, and worse, the racism accusations that led to him becoming leader, contributing in no small part to Corbyn being toppled, the weight of accusations, baseless, made against him, meant the lies travelled around the world before the truth got its boots on. Of course, Brexit was what ultimately finished Corbyn in that 2019 general election, but that was in no small part due to Starmer and his ilk as well, was it? Coming out for Remain as he did, with a second referendum option on the ballot. And just like so many other things, policies mainly, that we can point to since then, Starmer never meant. He's all about making Brexit work now, ever since he became leader, hasn't he? Which should have shown most people that he is nothing but a brazen liar, prepared to do or say whatever he wants if he thinks he can gain from it. Starmer has staked his reputation, such as that is, on dealing with anti-Semitism, as we know now, though. He made such a huge deal of it. But what we've learned over time, of course, is that not only has he failed to do that, but he's treated every other form of racism as secondary in order to promote his credentials as ensuring anti-Semitism never rears its ugly head again. Except he hasn't. More Jewish people have been purged from the Labour Party under Starmer than under any other Labour leader ever. His is not a party that challenges anti-Semitism. His is a party that instead champions Zionism and equates that with anti-Semitism. The recent court case of David Miller showing anti-Zionism to be a protected characteristic in the workplace makes that an impossible pill to swallow anymore and impossible to accept from Labour going forwards. By doing that, though, he has always left himself open to real accusations of anti-Semitism catching up with him. And so it comes to pass that the Rochdale by-election may actually end up being a defining moment in Starmer's leadership. Their candidate there, Azhar Ali, had been accused of what they called an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And Starmer's always said that his party has zero tolerance for anti-Semitism. Zero tolerance. All Ali did was agree with Egypt's version of events regarding October 7th and the Hamas incursion into Israel, where Egypt said they'd warned Israel sometime before that something was going to happen, and Israel very much just allowed it to. So they could do what they've been doing in Gaza for the last 4 months as a consequence of that. Seems a completely plausible thing for Egypt to say. Being a mediator between Israel and Hamas for some years, you've got no reason to lie over it either. Yet this, according to the Labour Party, was anti-Semitic conspiracy. How dare you question the Zionist state? So with zero tolerance, he was out, right? No. Starmer stood by his man, you see. Same faction. While numerous former Labour members were thrown out on trumped-up charges of anti-Semitism over the last 4 years, whilst Corbyn himself was cleared by the NEC and then summarily suspended by Starmer abusing his executive powers, and similar stories can be told about other Labour MPs and officials too, Starmer made an exception in front of the whole country and has been eviscerated for it. As author and former Corbyn speechwriter Alex Nunn said on Twitter about all of this, so the competent adults are in charge and Labour is not supporting its own candidate after standing by him while saying he spread an anti-Semitic conspiracy for which they have zero tolerance, except for when someone on their side does it, until it becomes too politically costly. Nail on head, as Alex so often is. Every Labour MP who has campaigned with Azhar Ali now must offer an apology, surely, for spreading anti-Semitism, therefore. Take Angela Rayner, for instance. She released a video promoting Ali. Surely she needs to apologise at least twice for that then, and then still be suspended, because that is how it works, right? Apologise and still get the boot. That's how it works. That's how it worked for Kate Ossamore the other week, didn't it? Lisa Nandy was up there and campaigning for Azhar Ali, endorsing Ali, when we know the party knew about what he'd said, because allegedly there are mixed accounts now about where exactly the leak came from, but all agree it was from within the Labour Party itself, so they knew all about them. They still knew all about what Azhar Ali had said, and they still let him stand. How is that zero tolerance? In fact, just this morning it has come out that at a meeting in Hyndburn, Lancashire, which incidentally was held last October, Ali made racist remarks by repeating what the party consider an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Not having been published, I can't say if it was repeating the Egyptian claim, but it was supposedly in relation to the Israel-Gaza situation. Numerous Labour councillors were in attendance, so the Jewish Labour movement, for whom all Jewish and anti-Semitic things under Keir Starmer's leadership must be judged and run past, have demanded that all of those councillors that were there be suspended as well. What, for just being there? Well, that is completely in keeping with Labour's handling of anti-Semitism, isn't it? Heck, whole groups of people were proscribed retrospectively after Starmer decided to abuse his power again, didn't he? That is how, for example, film director Ken Loach came to be expelled from the party. Sanctioning anyone for just being there. Thought police. But nobody's got any control about what might come out of a candidate's mouth that you might happen to be in the same room as. It's completely mad, of course. But it is what has been going on under Starmer for years. And the idiots running the right-wing JLM still think nobody's looking, but a hell of a lot more people are. But perhaps this is just an isolated case, Damo. They're only human. Mistakes could have been made in the selection. It's not an isolated case, is it? Let's talk about another candidate that's just come to light now as well. Graham Jones, Labour's guy standing for Haslingden and Hyndburn. Oh, that place again. Yes, because you see, he was also at that meeting in Hyndburn, you won't be surprised to hear. And given where he's standing, apparently was rather unkind in reference to Israel and questioned why British citizens were fighting with the IDF. He's quoted as saying, "I'm sure when world leaders go home, like me, pardon my French, they say, effing Israel again. No British person should be fighting for any other country at all, full stop. It is against the law and you should be locked." Plenty of us are swearing about Israel, and certainly we don't expect our people to be fighting for another country. But when it's Israel, apparently it's different. And now Jones has been suspended as well. He is a right-winger and awful in a multitude of different ways. But this suspension has caused problems for Starmer as well about how his party actually defines anti-Semitism and how it deals with allegations of it, or what they purport to be allegations of it. And in actual fact, so often, as is the case, it's proving more to be about anti-Zionism than anti-Semitism. Again, I repeat, this meeting was held last October, and yet mainstream Labour figures have come out in support of him too, clearly now in need of an apology and subsequent suspension, because as we know, that's how Starmer handles it, right? Well, who's backed Jones publicly then? None other than Ruth Smeeth, and she did so as recently as the start of this month. Smeeth is Jewish, an ardent Zionist, and is probably best known for concocting an anti-Semitism attack on left-wing activist Mark Wadsworth. But electronic intifada journalist Asa Winstanley summed her up better than I can. He said last year, following the truth of the Wadsworth story coming out, Ruth Smeeth MP had good reason to delete the post, claiming black activist Mark Wadsworth had used an anti-Semitic smear towards her at a Labour event. The idea that Mark Wadsworth had said she was part of a media conspiracy was completely untrue. Importantly, he did not make any kind of anti-Jewish comment. In fact, he didn't refer to Smeeth's Jewishness in any way. He later clarified that he hadn't even known she was Jewish. Wadsworth replied to Smeeth's false allegations in a statement the same day, describing them as poisonous slander. He said her claims played into a Jewish media conspiracy theory that I utterly reject and have never espoused. Wadsworth's instincts about Smeeth working hand in hand with the right-wing press to overthrow Corbyn were totally correct. Only 3 days earlier, Smeeth had played her own minor part in the coup attempt against Corbyn. She announced on Twitter, with a heavy heart, that she was resigning from a junior role in Corbyn's shadow cabinet. It was timed to coincide with a series of resignations by dozens of hostile MPs in a failed attempt to force him to resign. They came after the no-confidence vote tabled by Margaret Hodge and the firing of Hilary Benn, another right-wing shadow minister Corbyn had fruitlessly attempted to bring on board as part of his abortive big church approach. But unlike Wadsworth and the others, as a journalist reporting on the UK's pro-Israel lobby, I happen to be pretty well acquainted with Smeeth's work. I wrote a story about her in 2014 when she was selected as a Labour candidate. I did so because of two key facts, ignored by a media that would later pay her such close attention. She had worked as a spin doctor for the Israel lobby and had acted, wittingly or otherwise, as a secret Labour Party source for the US government. Smeeth, of course, has since been put into the House of Lords by Keir Starmer. There's this rather well-known photo of her at one of his numerous relaunches looking like his minder. So what has Starmer said about all of this? Nothing. People have recently joked on social media about crowdfunding for a fridge for Starmer so he can hide away from his dishonesty like Boris Johnson did. They are as deceitful as each other. But someone might have already done so because he's been nowhere to be seen. For 53 hours straight, the normally regular tweeter, Starmer, was silent, finally tweeting out about having visited Wellingborough with his Labour candidate there, 2 by-elections going to the polls on Thursday the 15th, completely overshadowed by Rochdale, which is another 2 weeks away still yet. Both these seats that are being challenged for on Thursday are Tory. You would expect Labour to take both, but will this legitimate abuse of racism being put on show by the party, their ardent support for Israel, just as the government are, as they discipline people for being anti-Israel and anti-Zionist rather than actual anti-Semitism, is that all going to do and have any real effect on those by-election campaigns? Is it going to damage the Labour vote? Because right now, all it does is expose Starmer's regime for being anti-Semitic itself, on top of all the anti-black racism and the Islamophobia that is treated as secondary to that I've covered in numerous other videos. It's ironic that it is anti-Semitism that is hammering Starmer's leadership so much now, though, when he staked so much on fighting it. Yet is now being exposed to have been blatantly weaponising it instead, and going into a general election this year at that. He deserves nothing less. He is purported to fight racism, when in reality he has fought criticism of Israel, and now it's destroying his administration. Like the coward he is, he sent shadow ministers out to defend Azhar Ali, and left them all in a giant pile of doo-doo as he inevitably caved in the end, and suspended Ali, and now it's happened all over again within days with Graham Jones. There have been 2 national polls out in the last 24 hours showing Labour's lead over the Tories is plunging. According to More in Common, no, I've never heard of them either, Labour's lead has dropped to just 11 points now, a majority of 40, so supermajority territory's out, and the much better known Savanta has seen Labour's lead drop to 12 points, a majority of 60. These polls were conducted before the current anti-Semitism fallout, the events that have happened in Rochdale with Azhar Ali and Graham Jones. These drops have come as a result of Labour bidding its Green Prosperity Plan. So there's likely to be more damage to come at the polls if this racism issue is cutting through. And it did after all with Corbyn, so why should it not now? Especially when these are the same people making all the accusations last time. Of course, some in the media are coming to Labour's defence, because of course they are. Some are even blaming Jeremy Corbyn for everything that has gone wrong in Rochdale, or at least trying to, as this video will explain all about. He's only been leader for 4 years now, guys, this Starmer chap. Have you heard of him? It's time Corbyn stopped living rent-free in your heads, surely, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so the situation in Rafah and throughout the Gaza Strip continues to get ever more dire as further attacks are committed against them by Israel, completely in violation of the International Court of Justice orders put in place as they continue to examine the plausible case for genocide demonstrated against them by South Africa. Just 9 days remain until Israel are supposed to report to the ICJ to show how they have implemented those interim orders, and instead all that is happening is Israel carrying on and completely ignoring those orders. So for the sake of the people of Rafah, with nowhere else to turn, nowhere else to run, and every other nation on the planet still even now ignoring what is happening there, South Africa are once again stepping in, turning to the ICJ and have petitioned them for emergency orders, if they have the power to deliver, before the IDF move into Rafah on foot with everything that could mean for the people there. Right, so the situation in Gaza continues to deteriorate and war crimes continue to be committed as Israel moves in ever closer on Rafah on the border with Egypt. For example, yesterday, just north of Rafah in Khan Yunis, the Nasser Hospital had its northern wall demolished and its warehouses torched. No safe corridor was provided for the 350 patients inside, and as they were ordered to evacuate, people leaving were shot by snipers. Cast your mind back to the beginning of this attack on Gaza when Israel said they didn't target hospitals. Do you remember that? Lies then and lies now, except their lies have lethal consequences for innocent people, and they no longer care anymore whether people believe them or not. You can hardly say they are targeting Hamas here, can you? But once finished in Khan Yunis, next there comes Rafah, hit with airstrikes again. Half the population of Gaza is there now. And where innocent people were always able to flee ahead of the IDF before, there's nowhere left to go now. And still our politicians sit around like gormless idiots doing nothing except arming the regime, committing all the destruction. South Africa took Israel to court already for this, and the plausible case for them committing genocide has been satisfied to the point it will now be judged on its merits, but that could take years. It surprised the world when the ICJ so overwhelmingly came down on South Africa's side, on the side of Palestine, in passing those provisional orders to prevent the killing of civilians, to stop the military killing civilians, to punish incitement to commit genocide, to provide aid and humanitarian assistance, to prevent the destruction of evidence, and to report to the ICJ within a month of the order being given on all measures taken to meet these orders, as was put on Israel to do and to abide by. Well, Israel broke them within 2 hours of them being set out, and they've ignored them ever since. They have 9 days left to report to the ICJ on how they've met these orders. February 23rd is the due date. I doubt they'll bother somehow. Well, knowing the people of Gaza have nowhere else to go now, and seeing Israel blatantly ignore the ICJ so far, arrogant as they are, and smug in the knowledge that someone will always excuse them, the nation equivalent of a spoilt brat as Israel seems to be, South Africa are the only ones seemingly interested in meting out some life-saving discipline to them. They have returned to the ICJ and have petitioned them to invoke emergency orders to save the people of Rafah. I've picked out the most relevant parts here. By way of an order dated 26th of January 2024, the International Court of Justice indicated 6 provisional measures against Israel. In making the order, the court ruled that there is urgency in the sense there is a real and imminent risk that irreparable prejudice will be caused to the rights found by the court to be plausible before it gives its final decision. There has since been a significant development in the situation in Gaza requiring the court's urgent attention. On Friday 9th of February 2024, the Office of the Prime Minister of the State of Israel issued the following announcement. It is impossible to achieve the goal of the war of eliminating Hamas by leaving 4 Hamas battalions in Rafah. On the contrary, it is clear that intense activity in Rafah requires that civilians evacuate the areas of combat. Therefore, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ordered the IDF and the security establishment to submit to the Cabinet a combined plan for evacuating the population and destroying the battalions. Despite strong denunciation by the international community, including by some of Israel's closest allies, the Israeli Prime Minister reiterated in an interview broadcast on Sunday 11th of February 24 that victory is within reach. We're going to do it. We're going to get the remaining Hamas terrorist battalions in Rafah, which is the last bastion, but we're going to do it. Thereafter, on Sunday evening, Rafah was subjected to an intense, unprecedented Israeli military assault with an ongoing threat of yet further intensification of the assault, including by way of an Israeli ground invasion. Rafah, normally home to 280,000 Palestinians, currently houses, primarily in makeshift tents, more than half of Gaza's population, estimated at approximately 1.4 million people, approximately half of them children. They fled to Rafah, pursuant to Israeli military evacuation orders from homes and areas that have been largely destroyed by Israel. As the International Committee of the Red Cross has made clear, there is no option for the evacuation of the Palestinian population in Rafah, as there is nowhere else for the people to go. The United Nations Secretary General has stated unequivocally that a large-scale military assault against Rafah would exponentially increase what is already a humanitarian nightmare with untold regional consequences. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967 has starkly warned that the risk of a massacre of unparalleled scale looms on the horizon. UNICEF has urgently highlighted the need for Gaza's last remaining hospitals, shelters, markets and water systems, which are in Rafah, to stay functional, underscoring that without them, hunger and disease will skyrocket, taking more child lives. The Commissioner General of UNRWA, referring to the growing panic in Rafah, has made clear that any large-scale military operation amongst this population can only lead to an additional layer of endless tragedy that's unfolding, reiterating that a military offensive in the middle of these completely exposed, vulnerable people is a recipe for disaster, to the extent that he is almost becoming wordless, not knowing how to describe this. UNOCHA has pleaded that we must do everything possible within our power to avoid the large-scale loss of civilian lives, to which intensified hostilities in Rafah could lead. The Republic of South Africa is gravely concerned that the unprecedented military offensive against Rafah, as announced by the State of Israel, has already led to and will result in further large-scale killing. Harm and destruction is serious and irreparable breach both of the Genocide Convention and of the Court's order of 26th of January 2024. Accordingly, and having regard to the situation of extreme urgency, the Republic of South Africa respectfully requests that the Court exceptionally consider exercising its power under Article 75.1 of the Rules of the Court. Article 75.1 provides that the Court may at any time decide to examine proprio motu whether the circumstances of the case require the indication of provisional measures which ought to be taken or complied with by any or all of the parties. South Africa thus respectfully calls upon the Court to consider as a matter of the greatest urgency whether the developing circumstances in Rafah require that it exercise its power under Article 75.1 of the Rules of the Court to prevent further imminent breach of the rights of Palestinians in Gaza. South Africa also reserves its own rights to take further action in respect of the situation. The whole thing is 3 pages long and available on the ICJ website if you care to read it all and pick through all of it yourself. South Africa set out the importance of quick action very well in their submission here, I thought. More and more people, I think, are gaining an appreciation for just how good the South African legal team are. But the important thing to note here is that invocation of Rule of Court Article 75.1. The Court may at any time decide to examine proprio motu whether the circumstances of the case require the indication of provisional measures which ought to be taken or complied with by any or all of the parties. Proprio motu means on its own impulse, and means the Court can act to put emergency new orders in place without the need for another hearing, as we observed last month. And of course, there isn't time for that. With the comments of Netanyahu being used as evidence once again, blatant and compelling as that once again is, it seems entirely reasonable to assume the court would view said comments just as seriously now as they did before. And of course, their decision-making proprio motu also takes into account the observable actions taking place here and now, and since their initial ruling on January 26th. I can see additional orders being made specific to Rafah. I can see Israel ignoring them again. So what is the point of all this then? Well, for one, it tells the people of Gaza that someone is on their side, that international law is on their side, and every nation signed up to the Genocide Convention is failing in its obligations to meet those obligations by failing to act to stop Israel acting as it is against them. It is another reminder to the international community to pull their fingers out of their backsides and step up. On the other hand, the one thing the court didn't do previously, although in effect did due to the interim orders being impossible to deliver without one, which it still has within its powers to order, is a ceasefire, to order Israel to stop immediately. Now, the court didn't overtly make that order previously, and the reason they didn't was because of Israel's right to defend itself. Here, it's different, I think. South Africa have made this emergency request specifically in relation to Rafah. The self-defence premise, in my view, doesn't wash here. It's the furthest point from the Hamas incursion on October 7th that there is in Gaza. It's the complete other end of the Gaza Strip. Not only that, virtually the entire remaining population of Gaza is huddled in the south. Half of them, as they've said in their submission, South Africa's submission, are huddled up in Rafah, all in one spot with nowhere to go. Where's their right to self-defence? Where many commentators and foreign affairs outlets rightly surmised the ICJ wouldn't order an immediate ceasefire previously on that basis of Israel's self-defence. In the case of Rafah specifically, given the nature of that area there, the number of people there now, I think that could change. I definitely think it should change. You have to bear in mind, if you cast your mind back to the overarching tenet of the South African case, the gist of it all, it was centred around creating conditions for life that are incompatible with life. That was their accusation against Israel. Nowhere now is that more starkly obvious than in Rafah, with so many people trapped there, absolutely nowhere else for them to go. If the ICJ doesn't feel it is in a position to order a complete ceasefire in Israel, it could in relation to that one place, Rafah. Israel could complain all it likes, moaning that the ICJ are stopping them from taking out Hamas. But given the impunity they take out civilians too, whilst purporting to do so, the justification is there. On the day South Africa filed this emergency request, Israel destroyed 14 houses and 3 mosques in Rafah, killing dozens in the process. We see similar night after night after night, and as much as I'm hoping for a quick and strong response from the ICJ, I can't help but think about how screwed we are as a species if it's only South Africa prepared to stand up and be counted, to stand for just basic humanity now. And so many other nations would rather be complicit in it. What actually does it say about each and every one of us that we keep voting these people into power to carry on? Of course, there's every risk that Israel might just blow the crossing and let everyone in Rafah flee into Egypt, ICJ order or not. Certainly a big concern of Egypt's right now is they're threatening to suspend the 45-year peace treaty between themselves and Israel if they do. The price Israel is prepared to pay in order to rid itself of the Palestinians of Gaza? Would you bet against it? Find out all about that story on this video recommendation here, and I'll hope to catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so while The Guardian over the weekend was busy trying to pin the blame on Jeremy Corbyn for Labour ditching their £28 billion green prosperity plan, Labour's flagship Starmer policy of the last 3 years, yes, it managed to last that long, as unveiled by Labour's self-proclaimed Green Chancellor herself, Rachel Reeves. It looks like it might be a case of £10,000 from Labour's very own climate change denial lobby to Reeves, in the form of a donation, of course, just weeks before the policy was formally binned, might be closer to the truth as to why that actually was. Before 2022, the donor concerned had apparently never given any money to Reeves. So why have they been gifting to her since? And if the convenient timing of their latest donation isn't begging the question of Reeves, what are they paying for? Have they bought the bidding of Labour's green policy? I'm not sure what does. Right, so Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer in a wig, that self-declared and very robotic Green Chancellor, could well be more like the latest example of party policy being bought and paid for. Labour now equally as bad for this as the Tories are. There really is no difference between them at all. And to people who say to me, Damo, why don't you bash the Tories more? I say I am, because Labour are Tories. It's just less obvious and needs pointing out more. If you know the Tories are awful and would never vote for them, why do you need me to tell you that? Labour, on the other hand, are still viewed as an alternative by many, but they blatantly aren't. Although I'd argue the Gaza situation has certainly opened more people's eyes to Starmer being no different. Anyway, in that respect, the open arms to the donors after spurning the members should, if anything, reinforce that newfound clarity regarding Labour of a great many people. The story here, the mainstream media have covered this to an extent, is that Reeves has received a £10,100 donation from Labour peer Lord Bernard Donahue, who describes himself as a climate sceptic more than a climate change denier, but has in the past been quoted as saying the climate change debate suffers from scaremongering and exaggeration. It really doesn't. In the last 12 months, global warming broke that 1.5 degrees per year increase in global temperatures that was marked as a significant goalpost by many scientists. Weather patterns are being shifted as ice coverage recedes and we see more glacier melt, just as a couple of for instances there. And it is the biggest crisis of our time, bar none. Donahue disagrees. He said of the move by Reeves, I thought that was a sensible decision in line with the national interest. As someone who's worked with prime ministers, you can't have wild spending, you've got to have control. The donation was totally unrelated. I haven't been involved in those £28 billion discussions at all, and quite rightly so. She needs help staffing her constituency. I think she's crucial to the Labour Party and the country. She's so sensible, and she's got such good political and economic judgment. Well, if that doesn't call your judgment into question, I'm not sure what will. Long-time viewers of this channel know that I, for an example, am a carer to 2 disabled people. Families like mine, many of them up and down the country, will never forget what Reeves said about being tougher on benefits than the Tories, especially in light of the deaths that have been caused by the Tory war on the poor. Her husband, in case people were unaware, was also a long-time DWP civil servant under this Tory administration. So she will be no different. She could even be worse. And she's making a show of it with her fiscal rules by binning every policy in sight. The Labour Party position being, we're not the Tories in their hope of winning the general election. That's it. That's their standpoint. Except, as I said before, more people are realising that actually they very much are Tories. So even that is a lie. It'd just be a change of faces and not a change in how the country is run. Donahue spoke of working for prime ministers. So who'd be surprised to realise the prime minister he was talking about was Tony Blair then? Actually, he worked for Red Tories, not Labour. And when asked about his climate change scepticism, he said, I did believe the globe was warming, and I did believe the emissions problem was generated by industrial human activity. But I couldn't be in the flag-waving green blob. What worried me was how we would pay for dealing with climate change. I was a kind of an oddball sceptic. I found that much of the stuff issued by the Greens didn't seem very factually based. People wanted to be approved of as green flag wavers, but they hadn't come to grips with the complex nature of the problem and what it would cost to take. Now you can see why he's such a fan of Reeves. Where will the money come from? He's one of those. Well, just as so many other people seem to have to be told, the money comes from a place called the Bank of England, also known as the Magic Money Tree, and both he and Reeves know it. You print it, you increase tax to balance, not pay for, but balance that spending so inflation doesn't rise. Who gets taxed? The answer should be bloody obvious to everyone by now, because every politician is dead set against doing so, and it is a wealth tax and it is a tax increase on the rich. But they'll take their money and run away, the Blairites wail. Well, actually, they're onto too much of a good thing here, and what you really mean is that your donations might dry up. Even if they did sod off, someone else would fill the void, because that's how business works. What are the donors paying for, though? That should be the first words on all of our lips every time someone gets some money like Reeves has here. If you're beholden to the rich to operate and run your party and cling to power or control, then you're owned by them and cannot, as a very obvious consequence, represent us. That is what made Corbyn so dangerous to these people. He crafted a party fully funded by ordinary working class people with a £5 here and a £10 there. And that could never do. Anyway, For as much as Donoghue insists he's not a climate change denialist, he is, however, a trustee of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, or GWPF, which is a Tufton Street think tank, and their aims are to challenge what it calls extremely damaging and harmful policies envisaged by governments to combat the human impact on global warming. Well, if that isn't climate change denial, I don't know what is. The GWPF is chaired by an ardent climate change denier called Terence Mordaunt, who, despite the same name and despite the fact he's given Tory MP Penny Mordaunt some £20,000 in donations, she claims they aren't related. Well, the genealogist in me really wants to see if that's true. Mordaunt is not a common name. All in all, if people thought the climate change deniers only existed in the Tory party, though, you thought wrong, because Labour has them too, and some of them have a lot of money to spend forwarding their aims. Anyway, with this donation having come into Reeves' possession, taking money from a climate change denier, and then weeks later binning what has been Labour's flagship policy for over 3 years, people will put two and two together, especially in light of calls for her to return the donation. She intends to keep it. It's for office costs, of course. Sure it is. What is Starmer, though? You might be thinking he's leader, not Reeves, which is completely sensible and logical train of thought, to which I'd make the comparison that if Reeves's insipid Tory style of money management means you'd better give her an abacus before she gets started, Starmer, by comparison, is still trying to work out how to count on his fingers. Now, that's a harsh statement, perhaps, Damo. You're letting your personal feelings get in the way here, and it's very hard not to when you've lived at the sharp end for long enough. Reeves is a former banker. She thinks like a banker. Bankers might know maths, but they make money work for them and not people, and she'll run the country like a bank and not in the national interest, therefore. As far as economics goes, though, Starmer might as well still be counting on his fingers. He's well known to not have a clue about economics, and that is why Reeves is always ever present when economic policy in Labour is being discussed, because Starmer can't come the general election, when the TV debates begin, and an economics question will probably destroy Starmer faster than anything else. And let's face it, it doesn't take a lot of effort to destroy him with even the softest question by even the most ardently loyal Sunday morning client journalist. Ultimately, Starmer's Labour is as beholden and influenced by those with money to work in their interests, wants and desires, and not ours, just as the Tories are. You vote Labour at your peril. A charitable person might give Reeves the benefit of the doubt over this donation, but a cynic might be more inclined to believe she's a grubby crook who just sold our children's futures for 10 grand. But that would likely invite accusations of being a non-grown-up, or an immoderate and pragmatist, or an insensible extremist, and possibly an anti-Semite too, just for good measure, you understand. Of course, it is far from only this that the robotic Rachel Reeves has given us reason to shun Labour, of course. I did another video not long ago where she gave us 4 more reasons to avoid her party like the plague. You can find out all about that here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so whilst the Rochdale by-election remains ringing in the ears of Starmer's Labour, having suspended their candidate and in all likelihood handing the seat to George Galloway, not incidentally with the now former Labour candidate giving up, by the way, because he's now standing as an anti-Starmer candidate, such as a Blairite scorned. Well, the whole spectacle there, however, shone a light down on Labour's weaponisation of anti-Semitism and how it has failed to deal with other forms of racism treated as secondary to that, notably Islamophobia and anti-black racism, exposing how Labour chose to give a free pass to members of the Starmer faction here and not others, racist by default. But now another demographic have highlighted the racism of Starmer's Labour against them, adding even more of a headache to his administration, though given in this case it is regarded as the last acceptable form of racism by far too many people. Will Starmer rise to deal with this, or compound his failure to actually combat racism even further? Right, so what's the story this time then, Damo? You're being uncharacteristically enigmatic in your intro. Well, if I were to ask you what the last acceptable form of racism is in this country, what would you say? Could you buy into, for example, the Maureen Lipman view that it is anti-Semitism? Given it's all anyone ever seems to bring up, certainly over the last several years, you can probably see how mad that view probably is. But fundamentally, it's the sort of racism that can end up on campaign literature. The sort of racism that an entire demographic means they can be attacked and still be a vote winner. And it is, of course, racism against the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities. Numerous Labour figures, not uniquely Labour, but notably, have attacked these people, persecuted throughout history as they have been. One notable example is Mr. Anti-Semitism himself, the former Labour MP who took a peerage from the Lords and became their anti-Semitism czar, John Mann. When MP for Bassetlaw, he wrote a handbook entitled the Bassetlaw Antisocial Behaviour Handbook, which included sections on how to deal with youth loitering, graffiti, neighbours from hell, and travellers. Well, this is a guy who is so vocal on his supposed support for Jewish people, yet denigrates the GRT community. The Holocaust, it should be remembered, didn't just see an extermination of Jewish people, 6 million of them, but up to 1 million Gypsies, Roma and travellers were wiped out too, amongst other demographics. I fail to see how you can pick and choose if you're genuinely about standing up for historically persecuted people. Yet here we are. Anyway, to the here and now. Because in the here and now, and this is something I've spoken of before, there is a Metro Mayor election coming up in the North East. Labour were formerly represented there by the excellent Socialist Mayor Jamie Driscoll, but being seen as the last elected Corbynite figure for Labour, and of course having committed the crime of socialism, he of course had to go, despite a record of achievement Starmer could only dream of. In the job creation and prosperity Driscoll has brought, he's become a very popular Metro Mayor, the North of Tyne Metro Mayor. But with Driscoll not selected, resigning from Labour and now standing as an independent, Labour selected the god-awful Kim McGuinness. Now, McGuinness has been Police and Crime Commissioner for Northumbria and is known to have made an anti-Gypsy tweet for which there was justifiable help, but she was never questioned on this. And of course, because it seems anti-GRT sentiment is very much regarded as some kind of second-class racism, it hasn't hindered her one bit. Well, the Traveller movement are now doing so, putting this very much back on the agenda now, before anyone decides to back McGuinness, before she answers for her conduct. Now, the Traveller movement has existed since 1999 and gained charitable status in 2000. It offers a number of services to help marginalised members of GRT communities in the UK. And this can range from lobbying and organising to access to justice and legal support, building positive presences within communities and helping them be heard, as well as supporting GRT members into employment and a lot more besides. They do an awful lot of good work. Unsung heroes fighting division that for too many is still seemed as acceptable. Well, on the matter of Kim McGuinness and her continued candidacy, the fact she has made no acknowledgement of her past comments, no apology for them, heck, standing by them might still be a vote winner for her for some, hence the issue, showing the work still to be done to end racism against GRT people, that they have now registered a formal complaint with the Labour Party for the publicly made racist slur Kim McGuinness made. Addressed directly to Keir Starmer, their complaint reads, "The Traveller movement are writing to complain against the selection of Kim McGuinness as the Labour Party's candidate as Mayor for the North East. It has come to light that the current Police Crime Commissioner for Northumbria has in the past made racist comments online against Romany Gypsy, Roma and Irish travellers. The Traveller movement is a national charity working to promote equality and human rights for Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities in the UK. We aim to challenge discrimination and break down barriers in education, health, employment and the criminal justice system. The Traveller movement works with Gypsy, Roma and traveller individuals and families to tackle prejudice and promote community cohesion." In a tweet in 2011, Kim McGuinness wrote, "F off, I'm not a Gypsy," in reply to a tweet. Both the original tweet and the reply have now been deleted. The term Gypsy is an exonym derived from the word Egyptian, given to the nomadic groups of people who migrated to Europe from northern India. Whilst the term gypsies is often used to refer to English Romany gypsies, Scottish gypsies or travellers, Welsh gypsies and other Romany people in UK data collections, the word gypsy is considered a racial slur for members of Roma communities. The word gypsy has often been used as an all-encompassing racial slur throughout the centuries to justify the discrimination and persecution of all nomadic peoples, including the Romany gypsy, Roma and Irish traveller people. Tragically, the Nazi regime murdered Roma people in their hundreds of thousands during the Holocaust. The use of this language perpetuates the systemic racism that Romany gypsy, Roma and Irish travellers face on a daily basis. Since this tweet, Kim McGuinness has not made a public apology, nor is there evidence that she has committed to ending systemic racism faced by Romany Gypsy, Roma and Irish travellers as a councillor or as a police crime commissioner. We are particularly concerned that the Labour Party has deemed it fit to have a police crime commissioner who harbours these racist views, considering the long history of police harassment and the prioritisation of enforcement of Romany, Gypsy, Roma and Irish traveller communities. We would like to know how Kim McGuinness was selected as the Labour Party's candidate for Leamington Ward on Newcastle City Council 2015, as Police Crime Commissioner for Northumbria 2019, and now as the party's candidate for North East Mayor 2023, when her racist views were on record. We understand that some of the selection decisions were made before your election as leader of the Labour Party. However, in your statement this week, you stated that the Labour Party has changed under my leadership. We would request you stick to that statement and treat the racist language used by Kim McGuinness in the same way as the former Labour candidates in Rochdale and Hyndburn. Romany, Gypsy, Roma and Irish travellers need assurance that our elected officials act in their interest, free from prejudice, and need to see strong action carried out by political parties when their members and officials are racist towards our communities. The Traveller Movement is happy to work with the Labour Party to help eradicate anti-Romany, Gypsy, Roma and Irish traveller discrimination from the party and look forward to working constructively with you. Well, there's the gauntlet thrown down, isn't it, really? That's a strongly worded letter, and if something like that came from, say, the Board of Deputies or Labour Friends of Israel or the Jewish Labour Movement, the accused would likely be suspended before their feet touched the floor. But for the GRT communities, well, Starmer has dragged his feet, suspending Azhar Ali in Rochdale and Graham Jones in Hyndburn, as referred to in that letter, for their anti-Israel comments. They weren't anti-Semitic, but because Labour treats anti-Zionism as the same as anti-Semitism and has suspended or expelled so many members on that basis, Starmer was frankly hamstrung and is damaged going forwards as that weaponisation of anti-Semitism now comes back to bite him on the backside, deservedly so. But here we have another candidate, another form of racism, and if Starmer fails to act to suspend Kim McGuinness, equal treatment for all after all, again the GRT communities and the Traveller Movement itself can point to it and say Labour doesn't treat all forms of racism equally, and there's a whole new other form of racism that Labour will be failing to act upon that all of a sudden will be thrust into the public eye. Traveller hate has to stop. It's no more acceptable than any other form of racism. And Labour once again are the ones exposed most of all for failing to deal with it. I fully expect Starmer to fail on this too. The fish rots from the head after all, hence so much of Labour's racism problems, the very same phrase so many of these awful people used to use against Jeremy Corbyn, which is now being used against Starmer and co, and correctly so. Which you can find out all about here on this video recommendation, which I highly recommend of course, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers folks. Right, so if by-elections could be compared to dirty water, there was clearly a lot of dirt to be dealt with last night in both by-elections that we saw, both locally and regarding the two national parties. The Tories were just stinking by now. Once you gave the constituencies a good wash, a good rinse, you flushed out all the dirt. The Tories, very much the solids here, sank to the bottom, but if you think Labour are the bright and shiny thing you've just cleaned up, you're much mistaken. They just floated to the top. They're the soap scum on the surface. They're the greasy film left behind on the thing that now looks so clean because whilst your dish detergent looked really good on the outside, in reality it was cheap and nasty and leaves a strange taste in the mouth next time you choose to use it. The Tories very much lost 2 seats last night, and ordinarily that would be cause for massive celebration. But Starmer's Labour winning them takes that sweetness clean out of your mouth, and actually they didn't win anything. Because like that stagnant bowl of dishwater, they only needed to stand still to win, and actually they didn't even manage that. Not only that, but already one of their winning candidates might have dropped Starmer's Labour into a whole new scandal, which I'll come on to in a moment. Net result is, though, that we all lose, because nothing changes if this gets replicated across the country in a general election. Right, so, for as much as I've discussed in numerous videos now the challenges being set up against the mainstream parties, notably in Labour seats because of the fact there is no difference between the Tories and Starmer's Labour, that they are in lockstep with each other, from the situation in the Middle East, not just regarding Israel and Gaza, but also Syria, Iran, and of course those Houthis in Yemen, but also to here at home, with their economics being a carbon copy of George Osborne's, thanks to him being the inspiration for Labour's insipid so-called Green Chancellor Rachel Reeves, more focused on austerity than anything green though. For as much as I've covered seats where things could genuinely offer some semblance of change and excitement, the 2 by-elections last night were never going to be that. Both seats were of course Tory defences. That they lost both seats was really not particularly unexpected, given what a massive pile of doo-doo Rishi Sunak has led the party into. The scale of their impending general election rinsing could well be record-breaking. We can hope that it is the final nail in the coffin of that rancid party finally. But sadly you have Reform UK waiting in the wings to take over, probably even worse. Right, so let's deal with Wellingborough first. This was the one most people knew about, because this was the by-election triggered by the deplorable Peter Bone, who had held the seat since 2005, a running joke of a politician really, and who suffered the wrath of his constituents following being found to have committed acts of bullying and sexual misconduct by an independent panel, and was recommended to be suspended from the Commons for 6 weeks. This was enough to trigger a recall petition, which passed. Bone was immediately binned as said MP then, and a by-election was triggered. Now, first and foremost here, consider his replacement Tory candidate, a woman called Helen Harrison. If you thought the Tories couldn't treat the people of Wellingborough with any more contempt than already having inflicted Peter Bone on them repeatedly, then nominating his mistress, principally, to replace him pretty much did. Harrison having been Bone's parliamentary assistant since 2019 and who Bone had left his wife for. Both out of work now, the grain fee train for this pair is now very much over. Now, I've spoken about demographics in other videos when it comes to constituencies, diversity driving change as we're seeing that do. But in this instance, there isn't much to cover here, being a Tory seat since 1969, except for a 2-election hiatus under Blair in 1997 and 2001. So Labour can take it, but only, it seems, when there's a big dramatic swing, such as the Blair landslide. And we're sort of expecting to see something along those lines again now. It's an East Midlands seat, and when you think of the Midlands, you think diversity. But it is not particularly ethnically diverse there. Over 85% of the population is white. That might strike you as classic Tory territory, in which case. The results tell a familiar story, though. Turnout was awful. We've seen this repeatedly in by-elections over the last several months, last couple of years, really. By number of voters, it was the worst turnout in Wellingborough since 1924. Worst turnout in 100 years. Except in 1924, such a small number of voters was actually 84% of the electorate there. But in 2024, it's just 38% of them. And before people moan about by-elections always being lower, that tired excuse they often use, there was another by-election in Wellingborough in 1969, and turnout was still higher then. Less than half the population, as awful as the Tories are, as terrible as Peter Bone was, bothered to turn out to pick a replacement. Labour won this seat on a swing of 28.5 points, but that only amounts to 13,844 votes. Bone in 2019 got 32,277 to win the seat. Contrast that with Helen Harrison, who last night got just 7,408. Labour won this seat with a pitiful number of votes. And I can justify that when you consider they, in 2019, the Brexit election, the election that gifted Boris Johnson that huge majority, Labour, in Wellingborough, that staunchly and celebratorially Tory seat that year, Labour got 13,737 votes then. Starmer is literally crowing this morning about saying that his Labour got more votes in Wellingborough than Labour got in 2019, as if that's a high bar in a solid Tory seat, but he actually only increased his vote by 107 votes. That's basically standing still, treading water, and watching the Tories get washed backwards behind you by means outside of your own control. That's what I mean by soap scum rising to the top. I suppose it could be considered rude to point out the 2017 general election, which Starmer's faction liked to pretend never happened, when Labour gained seats for the first time since Blair did in 1997, and say that Labour in Wellingborough got 18,119 votes. So sorry, Keith, people are not turning out for you in any greater numbers at all. The Tories stayed at home. By and large, some voted for Reform UK, who came third, likely picking up a few of these more right-wing, disaffected Tories. The other by-election was Kingswood. This seat was unexpectedly vacated by Tory MP Chris Skidmore, who quit with immediate effect over Sunak's decision to guarantee annual oil and gas licences. It is the backwards global warming insanity of Rishi Sunak, who exists in a world where making money is all that matters, and if it benefits his wife's company Infosys along the way, so much the better. Anyway, Kingswood is Bristol territory, southwest, often staunch Tory country, I should know, I live in the southwest, as again constituency diversity is often not prevalent in this part of the country, and it is even more white than Wellingborough in Kingswood, with over 90% of the population being white. Again, a picture often reflected in Tory seats, notably rural areas. The turnout here was awful too. In fact, it was even worse than Wellingborough, with just 37.1% of the electorate bothering, the lowest turnout in the seat ever since it was created in 1974. Again, the Tory vote completely collapsed because Tory voters stayed at home. In 2019, Skidmore won 27,712 votes, but his replacement, Sam Bromley, last night won just 8,675. Labour won the seat with just 11,176 votes. Starmer not crowing quite so loudly this time though, because Labour voters looked like they stayed at home as well. This one wasn't so much Labour standing still as the Tories went backwards, because Labour went backwards as well, just not quite as much. In 2019 again, when Johnson got that massive majority and Corbyn's name was mud, Labour still managed to get 16,492 votes. So Starmer last night won this seat, but actually lost 5,316 votes. Lost a third, roughly, of what Labour got in 2019. And of course it was even more than that in 2017, over 19,000 votes for Labour in that year. Already you might be interested to hear the winning Labour candidate, Damien Egan, is already miring Labour in another potential storm. As it turns out, he's married to a former Israeli Defence Force soldier. So is this known to the Labour Party ahead of election day? And considering there is currently a plausible case for genocide made against Israel now, and indeed its past transgressions against Palestine are very much in the public eye once more, and its supposed most moral army, more questions are now going to be raised over Labour's selection processes, and justifiably so. And I'll have more to say on this in due course, I have no doubt. Again, Reform UK stood here and likely took some of these more hardline right-wing Tory votes. The sort of people still believing that Brexit can work, which is all this bunch actually stands for, after all, coming third here as well. The Greens did well here as well. Bristol is becoming more and more of a Green Party stronghold, especially in the more central constituencies, less so in these more rural outer ones, but they kept their deposit in Kingswood for the very first time. These figures, if Tory voters keep staying at home nationwide, and let's face it, what reason are they being given to bother to turn out right now, is benefiting Starmer, and he can crow all he likes about how great and successful and lovely he is. But he isn't at all. He's standing still, or he's going backwards, and he's laughing all the way about it. This isn't a sustainable picture for power. Sure, it could deliver him into power, but we know he isn't going to change anything. He could well be even worse than the Tories, and what then? Generally, the Tories take several elections to sort themselves out when they get dumped out of power. They may be routed so badly at this year's general election that they never come back. Perhaps it'll finally encourage people to get behind another party entirely. But as we're seeing here, Reform UK are heavily benefiting from Tory fallout, and why wouldn't they when they are literally on our screens every single night via Talk TV or GB News? Heck, Talk TV employs most of the Reform UK leadership. The Green Party, meanwhile, they can't even get onto Question Time more than once or twice a year. If this sort of picture is reflected at the general election, we could have a record-breakingly poor turnout. Labour could have a record-breaking majority, but they'd owe it entirely to the Tories for falling apart and their voters staying at home, to a general public that can't look beyond two parties between which there is no difference. Some of that poor turnout will be due to ID requirements now as well. But if it's really bad again, that question of a democratic mandate will be raised. Equally, if Labour is truly awful as expected under Starmer, the Tories could be back inside a single term. That said, the longer the Tories leave calling the general election now, clearly the worse it is going to get for them, already now having lost more by-elections than any other government since the 1960s. Of course, we still have the Rochdale by-election to come this month, which will be far more interesting, as it is a far more ethnically diverse area. It is a Labour defence this time, and they've gone to absolute pieces there, so it'll be rather a novelty if Labour start winning Tory areas, but keep losing their own. What will that really say about them then, eh? They're even trying to blame Corbyn for it now, would you believe? Well, of course you can believe that. It's what they always do, I'm sure, but find out all about that story here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so as we're all becoming more and more aware of the events in Gaza, especially in Rafah right now at the hands of the IDF, one of the most concerning aspects is the lack of aid, the lack of food, and the continued defunding of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, and the consequences of that for the people trapped with nowhere to go and little food, water and medical supplies getting in, partly as a result of settlers blockading attempts to get it through, celebrating in the fact that the people in Gaza are starving. Of course, people fled their homes as the IDF advanced, running for their lives, leaving their belongings behind, including food. So the IDF have, whilst making their way through the Gaza Strip, in homes they haven't razed to the ground yet at any rate, been cooking up a storm using the food of people who now have none, enriching their own rations and performing for the Israeli media whilst they do it. Right, so Israel really is being exposed as a very sick, heavily propagandised society if the equivalent of a Mary Berry Sunday newspaper pullout, except for being presented by members of the Israeli Defence Force instead, is what passes for newsworthiness and entertainment. A lifestyle cooking feature published in the liberal-leaning Haaretz newspaper, their Hebrew-only version, it must be said, Google Translate once again, being my friend, coming to the fore, featuring members of the IDF, humanising them as they steal the food of the people who formerly occupied said housing. It's absolutely disgusting. Yet here the soldiers pose for the camera, a glossy little puff piece for the Israeli masses. It's like Can't Cook, Won't Cook. Remember that on the telly? Except instead of turning up with a mystery bag of ingredients to baffle a celebrity chef, it is the people blowing hospitals up and shooting kids raiding the cupboards of people that have been driven away that are doing the cooking with whatever they can find. Finding a lot more than the people who fled that home can now find themselves, should those particular people still be lucky enough to be alive. It is literally in the food section of this edition of Haaretz. It really is a culinary lifestyle piece. It is a sick premise. I'm stunned. Even more so when you consider Haaretz have been quite vocal in their opposition to Netanyahu and what he has been doing. It makes you wonder what other narrative differences there are between the Hebrew and English version of their publication. The article features a couple of IDF soldiers called Nadav and Ilam, both 37. One's a lawyer, the other's a PE teacher, and it is rancid. The soldiers talking about how they scrounge around in the abandoned properties, pilfering whatever they can find to add to their own food, and then glorifying it, saying how much it gives them a break from the fighting and how good it is for their mental health. Gives them a break. Their mental health. Ah, the poor dears. Genocide is such hungry work and takes such a toll, I'm sure. Not half as much as it is on those you're fighting, because let's face it, the vast majority of them can't find back, can they? You absolute psychopaths. So shall we see what they've been cooking up then? There's plenty of pictures after all. Here's the title picture. Look, captioned, in every home in Gaza we found olives, olive oil and lots of spices. We are cooking with mixed emotions. This one is particularly sickening, calling this dish bruschetta alla Gaza. Cooking in war conditions. We decided to turn the food into a place of sanity for us. I wouldn't personally go on about your sanity when the entire world is questioning it. This one could have come straight out of a cookery book. Cooking with killers and thieves, but captioned, to eat well and in organised, planned way whilst around there's a storm raging. Yeah, and you aren't on the receiving end of the storm. Here's another cookery book level photographic setup. Rice and curry, the furthest from India. But then it goes from bad to worse as further photos chase the sympathy vote for what these soldiers are going through. War meal. We understood that it is possible to fight and take part in campaigns and yet eat well, and this became the story of our unit. Yeah, thieving food from the abandoned cupboards of Gazan people, that's the story of your unit. When we sat and ate, people smiled and forgot about the distress for a moment. Sure. Except the people facing being bombed in Rafah right now night after night with nowhere else to go because they can't possibly escape from there. What about their distress? This is the worst you can imagine. For as much as Haaretz have called the actions of the Israeli government into question, you have to appreciate that this is the Israeli equivalent of The Guardian here. And liberals just have the most horrendous track record of othering things that should never be othered. If you're calling out Netanyahu, then you shouldn't be glorifying the soldiers carrying out his orders, doing his bidding, carrying out the genocide we're watching unfold every single bloody day. You certainly shouldn't be humanising people in an army that is repeatedly committing war crimes. This is the worst you can imagine, is it? Well, let me make a suggestion to you then for your next culinary puff piece that you might go to Rafah and ask the people whose food these IDF soldiers are tucking into what gourmet delights they can look forward to. What would the response be, though? Sorry, I had a bowl of rice last Tuesday. You should have been here for that. I don't know when I'm going to eat next. Oh, and by the way, can you tell those settlers outside the gates to shift their tents before we all starve to death? Can you also ask them while you're there to stop dancing and celebrating as we die of starvation too, please? At least let us get some sleep. Honestly, it's obscene. I've read some god-awful journalism in my time, but trying to gloss over genocide like this with a food article just had bile rising in my throat. It's just on a whole other level. An army marches on its stomach. That's the saying, isn't it? But the IDF are saying the quality of the food really boosts morale too. Well, I don't doubt it. The smell of death and destruction in the air after a hard day's genociding must really bring out the flavour. Haaretz went on, though. Haaretz asks about their feelings eating in Gazans' houses, knowing they had to flee. Yes, there is mixed feelings for sure, because I'm using their tools in their house. But on the other hand, we have to eat. Our instincts and our wish to eat supersedes this. It's important to clarify that these are abandoned houses, some of which are destroyed or are planned to be destroyed. And this is how we fight in Gaza. Oh, so the food is just going to go to waste then if the occupant's home is destined for destruction. I can only assume since you sat around there eating happily there are no Hamas operatives there then. In which case, why are you destroying the housing? Well, we can't very well move in and redevelop Gaza otherwise, I suppose is the answer. Though nobody's saying that out loud, are they? Housing has been destroyed just as much as hospitals, schools and other infrastructure has been. Almost 70% of housing in Gaza has been damaged or destroyed, so there is no intention of ever allowing people back to their homes, because their homes would need to still be standing, not slated for destruction, and that's based on the most recent estimates I've been able to source, which are dated to last December. It's almost certainly got to be higher now because the IDF have moved so much further south in Gaza. 22% of agricultural land has also been destroyed, making inhabiting Gaza, being able to live there and survive and support yourself, even more so than before, has become unsustainable. It would be remiss of me to not note that whilst the IDF are tucking into the food they find in abandoned houses, food warehouses in northern Gaza have been destroyed at the same time. I suppose that food there was just too accessible to people still in the refugee camps like Jabalia in the north. Not everyone, after all, fled south, just most of the population. But you need to make sure they can't eat either, I suppose. As this article went to press, the head of the World Food Programme announced that children are actually now dying of starvation in Gaza. We already knew that most people were eating less than once a day. With UNRWA being defunded and set to collapse still by the end of this month, with people dying of starvation, kids dying of starvation already, just imagine how much worse it's going to get once UNRWA does go under. And all because Western nations, again, take Israel at their word on UNRWA being infiltrated by Hamas, without any of the evidence having been shown. Alongside that, as part of measures to placate Genocide Joe, Benjamin Netanyahu promised shipments of flour would be allowed into Gaza. But in a sign that he isn't really in charge anymore, his far-right nut job of a finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, blocked those shipments. What's Netanyahu done about that? Absolutely jack, of course. It's so bad there that people are resorting to even trying to eat grass. The sad thing is, Haaretz, as far as challenging Israel and holding power to account out there goes, has been one of the best Israel have on offer. Yet when they do pieces like this, you have to be reminded that being the best of a bad bunch is not a high bar, and how Palestinians are dehumanized as a matter of routine across Israeli discourse. It's a sick society. It's an apartheid society led by even more sick leaders. I am revolted by this story. I'm reminded that we cannot ever stop paying attention to the situation in Gaza, and that we have to hold Israel and all those supporting the regime doing stuff like this out there in what they are doing to account. As we know, South Africa are one such nation doing just that, having taken Israel to The Hague, now planning on doing likewise with the US and the UK. But they have also petitioned the ICJ here and now for an emergency order specific to Rafah to get aid in and keep Israel out. A story which you can get all the details of here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so I made passing reference to this piece of news in my video covering the Wellingborough and Kingswood by-elections, the results of which we heard last Friday, because it basically broke later in the day, and that video had basically already been written. But this is really serious in light of Starmer's Labour and its stance on Israel and Gaza, that one of their newly elected MPs is actually married to a former member of the Israeli Defence Force. There will be some who will say, oh, well, it's anti-Semitic to point to this as a reason the candidate Damien Egan shouldn't have been selected. I'm not saying that. However, there are questions associated with that. That will be a nonsense thing to ask. There will be others who will point to this in light of the events in Gaza right now and shrug and say, well, this is merely bad optics. But it's more than that too. When so many are calling for sanctions against Israel right now, and a parliamentarian in a position to make laws on such matters can now clearly be seen to at least potentially be compromised. Worst of all, though, I think, is that you couldn't have a better fit in Starmer's Labour and its position on Israel than someone like Damien Egan. Because if you can be married to a former IDF soldier, what does that say about their position on Zionism or Israel and the atrocities going on now? And how would you likely vote in terms of Israel in Parliament? When state loyalty is already being questioned of many MPs, would this new guy vote for their benefit or ours? Right, so Labour celebrated winning the seat of Kingswood from the Tories yesterday by managing to lose over 5,000 votes. The Tories simply managed to lose a lot more as their voters basically stayed at home, but clearly a lot of Labour voters stayed home too. But it soon came out that the winning Labour Kingswood candidate, Damien Egan, was married to an Israeli, a chap called Yossi Felberbaum, who was a former IDF soldier no less, having apparently ended his time with the IDF in October of 2017. However, a Spotlight of the Week post by Birthrate Israel Excel, a body based in the United States to nobody's surprise, who organised 10-day heritage trips for young Jewish people to Israel, said a lot about Felberbaum in an article they'd written. And it reads, Meet Yossi Felberbaum, an Israeli peer from the class of 2013. Yossi was born and raised in Kiryat Yam, a town just a few miles north of Haifa. Yossi graduated from Ben Gurion University of the Negev with a BSc in software engineering and recently completed his MSc in computer science in IDC Herzliya. After 6 years of service in the Israeli Defence Forces, he will finish his duty this October. Yossi plays an important role on the Israeli Community Board as a liaison between Excel and the IDF, assisting with the recruitment of 8,200 unit soldiers as Israeli peers. He looks forward to travelling to Europe and the United States after he finishes his service in the IDF and will pursue a career abroad in software engineering. Good luck and thank you for everything you do, Yossi. So he was formerly IDF and was on the Israeli Community Board recruiting 8,200 unit soldiers. Unit 8200 is Israel's cyber intelligence and cyber warfare department and has come up in relation to Keir Starmer's Labour before, since Starmer hired another former 8200 soldier, Azhar Kaplan, to basically spy on members' social media as part of the ongoing Labour purges and transformation of the Labour Party into a pro-Israel carbon copy of the Tory party. So that's Yossi Felberbaum. But he's the husband of the Labour candidate here. But how much of an influence he might be matters, though. And we can examine that by looking at Damien Egan himself and his actions leading up to him getting elected as MP for Kingswood. Now, Egan was born in Cork in Ireland but grew up in Bristol, so it is home turf for him, even though his studies took him to London, where he subsequently ended up becoming Labour Mayor of Lewisham in 2018. He's tried to become an MP before. He stood for Weston-super-Mare just outside of Bristol in 2005 and stood for the London seat of Beckenham in 2010. Now, while Mayor of Lewisham, despite being raised as a Catholic, he converted to Judaism. And of all the publications he chose to speak to about that, he chose the Jewish Chronicle, who interviewed him about this in 2019. Here's a passage from that particular article that I found rather interesting, though. I mentally knew I was a Catholic, as if it's on a document somewhere rather than something you're actually practicing, he says. But even as a lapsed Catholic, Mr. Egan maintained a kind of spiritual curiosity. I was always growing up interested in faith and thinking about all faiths. Visits to Israel and conversations with Jewish friends sparked an interest in Judaism. It was something I felt connected with and wanted to know more about, but I didn't feel any pressure as to when and where I'd explore that. That began to change 3 years ago when Mr. Egan met his Israeli partner. It wasn't directly connected to meeting Yossi, but part of it was going into a relationship with someone and thinking now is the right time to explore that further. It felt natural. Now, I have zero problem with people converting from one religion to another. It is raising an alarm in my head when Egan speaks of visits to Israel, having sparked his interest to do so, though. A great many Jewish people around the world are extremely opposed to many aspects of the Israeli view of Judaism, particularly the conflation of their state with anti-Semitism. So is that part of Egan's faith as he perceives it or not? There's the other more obvious perhaps issue in that paragraph, which is that things began to change according to the JC for Egan when he met his partner Yossi 3 years earlier. This article was written in 2019, so he met Yossi Felberbaum in 2016 then, when he was, as we now know, still actively serving in the IDF, in which case. What influence was he then, especially in light of him being connected to Birthright Israel and their premise of encouraging people from abroad to investigate their Jewish roots in Israel, many of whom I'm sure it would be logical to conclude, wouldn't it, would later become settlers? Is that a fair assumption to make or conclusion? I think it is. Of course, we're drawing conclusions that are perhaps unfair though. So given Egan has been in the public eye for a number of years now, is there any sign within his work of perhaps pro-Zionist or anti-Palestinian sentiment? Well, following the events of October 7th, Egan issued a statement on behalf of Lewisham Council on October the 10th, which read, Mayor of Lewisham, Damien Egan. It was truly appalling to hear about the terrorist atrocities in Israel. We condemn this awful attack and the tragic loss of life. Our thoughts and prayers are with the innocent victims and their families, and we understand these attacks will have an impact on many Jewish families and those with families in the region across our borough. Sadly, we know that heightened violence in the Middle East can often see an increase in hate crime in London and the UK. As the country's first borough of sanctuary, we have a proud history of supporting people fleeing violence and persecution and of being welcoming and inclusive, and it's now more important than ever for us to live these values. The Metropolitan Police have increased patrols across the capital, and locally officers have been making visits to provide reassurance and support. They urge anyone with any concerns about public safety to contact them. If you or someone you know is affected by what has already happened and needs support, please reach out. We stand united against hate. A fair statement, you might say, when you consider it's in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. However, I've been passed an email in response to this dated 22nd of November, addressed to Damien Egan, asking why he had not passed comment in relation to the deaths of Palestinians following October 7th. The question asked in this email was, I read the Mayor's statement on the Middle East conflict that he wrote on 10th of October. He did not mention at the time anything regarding the Palestinian lives that had been lost. Why is that? Does he want a ceasefire and an end to the deaths of more Palestinians? It's a fair question. Certainly Egan's statement mentioned Israel and mentioned people of the Jewish faith specifically and nobody else. However, as I said, this was in the immediate aftermath. There was a lot more to be learned in the following days and weeks. Certainly the narrative shifted from sympathy with Israel to utter condemnation for a lot of people. So here was an opportunity, therefore, for Egan to make that clear in his response. But here is what was actually said in reply to that question. The Mayor made a statement regarding the terrorist attack and pogrom conducted by Hamas in Israel on the 7th of October. The statement specifically talks about the impact the conflict has on families in the region. The region is made up of people of many faiths and none. In Lewisham, though, our faith groups, we have offered support to those in the local community who have been affected by the conflict in the Middle East. We have people in our borough who are very concerned about their family and friends across the region. It is our role to help bring our communities together and offer them support. We have also engaged with individuals who have expressed their concerns about theirs and their family's safety here in Lewisham as a result of a spike in anti-Semitic incidents. The Community Safety Trust, Tell Mama, and the police have reported increases in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia across London. The Mayor supports the continued humanitarian pauses in Gaza and welcomes the increases in aid to help address the humanitarian situation. All life is precious, and the Mayor hopes that an end to the conflict and a peaceful resolution can be achieved as quickly as possible, including the return of all hostages and a Gaza free from the terrorism of Hamas. Okay, so firstly, Egan delegated this out to somebody else to respond to, as can be gleaned by him being referred to in the third person. It also didn't directly address the question asked regarding Palestinian lives lost, merely hoping that the people of Gaza no longer suffer from the terrorism of Hamas. Well, it isn't Hamas's terrorism that is making them suffer, is it? It was a tin-eared response at best, an ignorant one, given Egan didn't deal with it himself at worst. Now, Some might argue that other Labour figures are worse in their responses. Others might say, well, he's basically aping the Starmer line here, the official party line here. In which case, great, we've got another Starmeroid MP, just what we need. These public responses are political, not personal. But you know what is? Social media. You take a look at some of the people that somebody chooses to follow, for example, such as an Instagram account. So how about we take a look at Damien Egan's then to see what sort of people he chooses to follow. Damien Egan follows just 1,115 people on Instagram at the time of writing, but amongst them are a number of names that stand out because they are ardent and unapologetic Zionists. He follows such people as Rabbi Yishai Fleischer, a prominent settler activist who is an advisor to the hard right security minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. He follows Hen Mazig, who is a prominent Israeli speaker and activist, who has referred to a Gazan ceasefire as being anti-Semitic, saying it amounts to Jews endorsing their own genocide. He follows Ziv Koren, a photojournalist best known for documenting the activities of the IDF. He follows Shabbat Lubavitch movement, a sect of Judaism which is opposed to the formation of a Palestinian state, and that runs contrary to the official Labour Party line. And he follows Benjamin Netanyahu himself. Other notable names I spotted that he follows are, of course, Keir Starmer, but also Wes Streeting as one example of a number of Labour MPs of a certain faction, the Zionist actress Deborah Messing, Michael Gove, Luke Akehurst of the Labour NEC and director of We Believe in Israel. He follows Luke Stanger, the Labour activist featured in the Labour Files documentaries as someone Luke Akehurst helped avoid expulsion over alleged harassment and intimidation. And I don't know whether he follows these people all of a sudden because he's now a South West MP, but I happen to know that Egan now follows a couple of Cornish Labour candidates such as Labour's Camborne Raith Hale election choice Perrin Moon and Truro and Falmouth candidate Jane Kirkham. Read into that what you will. I think who you choose to follow yourself, though, on social media does tell other people a lot about you. Egan's husband, incidentally, has his Instagram account set to private. Damien Egan, I think, does have a lot to clarify. Circumstantially, which is all of this is, there's a fair amount of stuff that a lot of people will look at and frown at and want answers to. For those familiar, for example, there's another adjunct. For those familiar with the John Profumo case in the 1960s, you might know that Profumo himself resigned when it turned out he shared his girlfriend, Christine Keeler, with a Soviet attaché, and as such his loyalties became a matter of question. How can Egan, as a man who is married to an Israeli intelligence officer, former or not, who converted to Judaism after meeting them and visiting Israel, not come under similar sort of questioning in this day and age, knowing what we know about Israel now, what the spotlight is focusing on, and the genocide that's being committed in Gaza? Frankly, the Labour Party, led as it is by Keir Starmer, the self-declared Zionist without qualification, needs to come under that level of scrutiny too, especially as he continues to fail to apologise for saying Israel has the right to commit war crimes by cutting off food, water and fuel. How did Egan make it through the selection process with all of this attached to him? Little wonder the hashtag Tel Aviv Keith is trending as I wrote this, though, is it? Meanwhile, an Israeli newspaper has just run a lifestyle magazine article all about the IDF, cooking up a storm in the abandoned homes of Gazan people who left their food behind and are now starving to death in Rafah, about how supplementing their IDF rations with the stolen food found in the kitchen cupboards of these now abandoned houses helps their mental health. The mental health of the IDF, yes, we're all very, very concerned about that, aren't we? It's one of the most depraved articles I've ever read, actually, and you can find out all about that here in this video, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Keir Starmer's racism problems continue to worsen, as I highlighted in a video the other day, as the Traveller Movement, a charity representing members of the Romani, Gypsy, Roma and Irish Traveller communities, have pulled Keir Starmer up over the selection of Kim McGuinness, the current Police Crime Commissioner for Northumbria, to be their candidate for the North East Mayor post, given racist commentary she has made in the past, which she has never been held to account for, that we know of. Well, now she is being held to account, just not by Starmer. Not only have the Traveller Movement written to Starmer demanding answers about this, but the wider community is now as well, especially given the reasons allegedly given as to why the successful incumbent North of Tyne Mayor Jamie Driscoll was deemed to not be good enough to represent Labour for this position now. Right, so Kim McGuinness, despite having made a racist tweet regarding the GRT communities all the way back in 2011, which she has never been held accountable for, despite being a Newcastle City councillor and now the Police Crime Commissioner for Northumbria in the time since, and now hopes in future to be the North East Mayor, all representing the Labour Party, and never once, it seems, being questioned about that tweet. Because, of course, racism against the GRT communities is seen as the last acceptable form of racism in this country. It, of course, isn't. And it is way past time our politicians got their act together and stopped acting like some kinds of racism are more or less important than others. All racism is bad. It is all equally bad and should be treated with equal seriousness. Now, yesterday it is alleged in the Chronicle that Kim McGuinness has apologised for the offensive remark that she made, except they didn't deem it necessary to publish said apology. However, they did publish a comment from a Labour source. Yes, one of those again. That response reads, 13 years ago, in conversation with a friend, Kim used a term she'd never use now. She understands why this would be offensive to the traveller community, and for this, she reiterates her apology. As a councillor and Police and Crime Commissioner, Kim has proactively campaigned against racism, promoted equality, and prioritised fighting hate. Well, as the Traveller Movement letter to Keir Starmer stated, though, there is no record of a former apology, which the Chronicle claims she had already made at some point in the past. And we only have this Labour source's word that she has reiterated it, given nobody has publicly seen it. And let's face it, she caused offence to the GRT community. Should they at least not be able to see it? This should be a public apology. There is no evidence, however, that she has ever apologised. McGuinness was purportedly selected over the current North of Tyne Mayor, Jamie Driscoll, whose role is being amalgamated into this North East Mayor role. And despite him being enormously successful in that post, because he committed the heinous crime of sharing a stage with film director Ken Loach to talk about his latest film, The Old Oak, Loach had been expelled from Labour because he basically wouldn't roll over and condemn the proscribed group Labour Against the Witch Hunt, which stood against the purges of ordinary Labour members, overwhelmingly on the left, mostly on trumped-up charges as those against Driscoll and Loach themselves now show. Because Driscoll was overlooked for daring to share a stage and have a conversation about a film, and indeed had nothing to do with politics whatsoever. How can sharing a stage with Loach, not talking about politics, be a suspension or expulsion offence? It's like we're hearing now with the Jewish Labour movement allegedly demanding that anyone in attendance at the event where former Labour candidate for the Rochdale by-election Azhar Ali voiced his agreement with the Egyptian assessment of the events leading up to the night of October 7th in Israel be suspended just for being in the room with him. That is insane thinking. It is blatantly factional weaponisation of racism, in my opinion. It's nuts. Loach was expelled for daring to have an opinion too, that Starmer's Labour didn't like, and Driscoll replaces a candidate for sharing the same oxygen as Loach on one night. The reality is both Driscoll and Loach are of the left, are socialists, and Starmer's Labour wants such people out, and are prepared to trump up ridiculous notions in order to forward their thinking and their agenda. So in light of all of this, here is an infographic doing the rounds on social media, and it lists 17 questions that Keir Starmer now has to answer in relation to Kim McGuinness's alleged apology, and a whole lot more. McGuinness tweeted out in 2011 to a friend, lest we forget, in a now deleted tweet, "F off, I'm not a gypsy." Therefore, the questions put to Starmer read: do you agree that this tweet is racist? Do you have zero tolerance for racism? And if not, how much racism is acceptable? Would you accept this behaviour if I said, "F off, I'm not a Jew"? Why has the Labour Party failed to reply to any of the complaints made in July 2023 in relation to this? Why did your selection procedures repeatedly fail to detect this racist tweet, or did they detect it? When asked the standard question, have you done anything that could embarrass the Labour Party or bring it into disrepute, at every selection process, what was Ms McGuinness's answer? Does Ms McGuinness accept that her behaviour was racist? Why has Ms McGuinness failed to apologise in the 7 months since this issue gained prominence? Why does Labour's statement say Ms McGuinness has apologised when no record of this apology exists? If she did apologise, please state when and where and to whom. If she did not apologise, why did you say she did? Did she lie to you, or are you lying to us? Do you think that Ms McGuinness is an excellent candidate of the highest quality, as you said on ITV on the 5th of October 2023? Is this the standard of behaviour you expect from a serving police and crime commissioner? Why was Councillor Niku Ayon, a Roma councillor, blocked from the shortlist during the 2023 North East mayoral selection process? Do you think the EHRC should investigate this? Do you think Ms McGuinness's racist tweet is more racist, less racist, or about the same as talking to a filmmaker at an arts festival about an anti-racist film made in the North East? I think that does cover all the bases, don't you? It is notable that Ken Loach's film is an anti-racist piece about refugees arriving in the North East and the struggles to integrate into society that comes with that, challenging far too many mainstream narratives concerning refugees, not just in the media but politically as well. There was a Roma Labour councillor in the running at one point, but they got dropped at the shortlist stage, Niku Ayon. And it does warrant questioning why that was, especially when one of the shortlisted candidates, Paul Brannan, apparently didn't even know he was standing for the post. Too much of this story smacks of Ayon being there to meet the ethnic minority requirement, only to be ditched when that was met, and he was no longer needed. Another angle on that might come from the fact that Newcastle City Council, Labour run, has been urged to back a ceasefire in Gaza and has failed to do so, despite 7 Labour councillors there trying to make their party see sense, including Niku Ayon. The list of questions should be on hand everywhere that Kim McGuinness turns and everywhere Labour campaigns for her. They should be on the lips of every other candidate in the running for that post too, including Jamie Driscoll, who is now running as an independent. It should especially be a question that everyone, not just those in the GRT communities, but those supporting them too, should confront Starmer with wherever he goes. And Labour candidates on the doorstep at upcoming local elections, and of course the general election when it comes as well. Anti-GRT racism is no more acceptable than any other form of racism, and sadly Labour are very much still ignoring it. But then when it comes to racism in all manner of forms, unless it's anti-Semitism, it's what we expect from them now, isn't it? As for the Traveller Movement's letter to Starmer & Co. and what they wanted answers to, I covered that here in this video if you care to find out more on this ongoing latest racism crisis for Labour, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers folks.